He told me himself that he committed the murder.
Okay.
And it was the murder of Cindy Burger.
Cindy Burger, is it B-U-R-G-E-R?
I guess.
Okay.
Because I really do want you guys to find this out. I mean, I'm a good law-abiding citizen, and I can't believe that I've had this information for so long.
Okay, you sound pretty upset. Is he related to you, or?
I don't want to say.
You don't want to say?
I can't believe I'm calling.
You're doing the right thing.
On the afternoon of August 29, 2000, the Ventura Police Department of California received a 911 call from an anonymous woman. Detective Matt Harville answered the phone and found that while the mystery caller did have a crime to report, she was talking about something that took place 7 years ago. The woman said that she knew who the killer was behind the murder of a woman killed in 1993. She was hesitant about making the phone call, but Detective Matt Harville was able to win her trust and get everything she knew about the case in a calm manner. Detective Harville noted that the woman supplied him with a ton of details about the case.
The guy, and she named him Michael Schultz. Michael Schultz had murdered her, placed her in a bathtub with some chemicals, lit the apartment on fire. She's giving me a lot of detail.
This included how the murder was carried out and how the killer tried to erase the evidence of everything and get away. However, he wasn't aware of this particular case at all. Was this woman giving the missing pieces of a cold murder case, or was this another hoax call trying to trick the police? Detective Harville searched the database for homicide cases to look up a victim named Cindy Burger. He landed on the cold case of Cynthia Burger, which involved the assault and murder of Cynthia that took place on August 5, 1993, at her residence at Port Hueneme. After taking Cynthia's life, the perpetrator tried to get rid of all the evidence by setting her house on fire. He also submerged Cynthia's body in a lot of bleach in her bathtub to remove his DNA from her body. Although the fire did burn away everything, his fluids from Cynthia's body after the assault survived the fire and the bleach. Cynthia Burger was a 44-year-old woman who worked at a car dealership as a manager. She lived alone at her residence, a 2-story condo with a garage. Responding to the fire in her house, the fire department found her naked body lying face down in her bathtub. The first indicator that this wasn't a natural fire, even before things were sent to the forensics, was the huge amount of bleach found in the bathtub. Her autopsy had revealed that she was assaulted and she was strangled to death. Detective Harville's search led him to the officer who was originally assigned the case 7 years ago, Detective Dennis Fitzgerald. Harville contacted Fitzgerald to know more about the case and told him about the anonymous tip he had received.
After hearing his conversation with her and what he told me, I immediately knew that this probably was our guy.
As soon as Detective Fitzgerald heard the name of Michael Schultz, his mind instantly zeroed down to the man who could very well be the missing piece of the puzzling case of Cynthia Burger. More importantly, the police didn't even need to catch Schultz. He was already a known criminal and was serving time in a prison camp in High Sierra. Cynthia's killer had carefully planned the murder and the procedure to remove all evidence. He had carefully disabled the smoke detectors and fire alarm system in her house before setting Cynthia's bed ablaze. Schultz had tossed the dead and assaulted body of his victim with bleach and certain other chemicals in the bathtub to destroy as much evidence as possible. Despite this attempt, his fluids survived and were collected and stored by the forensic department as Detective Fitzgerald worked to find a break in the case. Now, after 7 years of this murder case having gone cold, an anonymous caller had trapped Michael Schultz in the net of the police for his near-perfect crime. At the time of the murders, despite being a known offender, there was no evidence or reason to suspect him in the case. Interestingly, the anonymous caller was none other than his fiancée, Teresa Mooney. Despite being in love with him, Mooney chose to side with justice and came forward to the police. Michael Schultz had kept the secret of his heinous assault and murder of Cynthia safe with him all these years. However, being held prisoner in High Sierra wasn't working in his favor, and he could have been traced back at any time. Schultz was serving the sentence for a string of burglaries and assaulting a police officer in High Sierra, and his release was still due by a few months. But he had asked Mooney to help him escape the prison before anything went wrong. This forced him to unveil what he had done back on August 5, 1993, and narrate every detail to Mooney. Mooney was shocked to learn the horrifying things her fiancé was capable of doing to another woman, yet she had kept this a secret buried safe. However, she confided in her daughter and told her everything in an effort to lighten her load. Not wanting her mother to be associated with such a dangerous person any further, she demanded Mooney report Schultz to the police, or she would report him herself. Thus, Mooney made the call to the Ventura Police Department on August 20th, 2000, and gave the police everything she knew about. Detective Fitzgerald instantly ruled out the possibility of this being a hoax call. Since Mooney revealed the usage of bleach to remove evidence, this information was never made public and only could have been known by the killer or someone who the killer confided in.
He told me that he put her in the downstairs bathroom in bleach and some other chemicals so that they couldn't trace the DNA.
And thus the police got a warrant to get a DNA sample from Schultz. Moreover, Schultz was also once caught for executing a failed burglary with the same modus operandi. The result matched with the body fluid sample recovered from Cynthia, and her cold case, after 7 long years, finally had a perpetrator. But the cops were still short of one answer. Why did Schultz assault and kill Cynthia Burger in such a cold and calculated way? The People v. Schultz case was heard at the Ventura County Superior Court. The DNA match had completely pinned Michael Schultz down, and there was no escape for him. Pieces of Detective Fitzgerald's investigation showed that the killer was living near the residence of Cynthia Burger at the time of her murder. The police had a simple theory behind Schultz's motive. He was a predatory burglar who found that Burger lived alone in her residence, and after he was familiar with her lifestyle, then he went in for the robbery, as well as her assault and eventual murder. This was also supported by the confession he made to Teresa Mooney and the police as well.
I didn't betray Michael. Michael betrayed me long before. He betrayed me when he did what he did to Cynthia.
It was also revealed that Schultz was under the influence of amphetamine at the time. The nature and severity of the crime, including the fact that Schultz also left a fire in his wake that could have easily spread to other houses, made the court sentence him with the death penalty. Schultz's lawyers tried to get him off death row, emphasizing the involvement of amphetamine and a difficult childhood experienced by Schultz. They also pointed out certain legal irregularities in the trial to get him a pardon from the lethal injection. Their client also appealed to the court to spare his life. However, while the court wasn't considering letting the killer get away, his words made the court double down on its decision. Michael Schultz said that he had assaulted and murdered Cynthia Burger to make the Burger family pay for a betrayal back in 1942. He alleged that he wanted to inflict the same pain on Cynthia's father, Had Burger, that his family experienced when a relative of his betrayed 6 of his fellow Nazi soldiers and handed them over to the U.S. Schultz had said, "The rage and paranoid delusions I was having back then, combined with all the amphetamines in my system, have made me believe the only way to avenge the executed soldiers was through what Mr. Burger held dearest to him, his daughter." This was the first time anything of this nature was ever mentioned in this case. More importantly, the defendant had read these lines from a handwritten note. Thus, the influence of amphetamine and the story of the difficult childhood became even weaker. This clearly stated that the assault and murder weren't just premeditated, but also the result of a hate crime. Schultz's lawyers made no attempt to defend their client after these words. Notably, Schultz said the German soldier who betrayed his comrades was named Ernest Burger. The Burger family shockingly revealed that nobody in their lineage had any connection to this soldier, which makes the story of Cynthia even sadder. On February 26, 2003, he took his last breath before getting executed in California's lethal injection chamber. The reopening of the cold case of Cynthia Burger raises more questions than answers. What initially looked like a burglary turned into an assault cum murder, later evolved into a hate crime that had its ties to the Second World War. Michael Schultz had not made any mention of a Nazi connection throughout until the time of appealing to the judges for a pardon from the death penalty. The fact that a common burglar like him could disable smoke detectors and later use bleach to get rid of evidence showcases that he wasn't an ordinary robber. But his lust that led him to assault Cynthia proved to be the link that eventually got him executed. On the other hand, while he had told everything to Teresa Mooney, he had omitted any information about the murder being a hate crime. Since the Burgers revealed they didn't have any connection to the German soldier Schultz hated, was everything a figment of his imagination? Or did he just get the wrong person? With Schultz dead and buried, the answer to this question will remain a mystery.
Did you kill her?
Yes, sir. I can see blood on the side of her neck. I can remember grabbing some bags and placing her in the bags and taking her to a car.
May 27th, 1979 seemed like any other day in Houston, Texas. Then a man stumbled upon the battered and half-naked body of a young woman along the slope of a bayou. The victim was identified as Inez Deaton, a 21-year-old local. The ruthless nature of her murder plunged the community into a state of fear and prompted immediate action from law enforcement. As the investigation unfolded, a person of interest emerged. However, just as investigators believed they were making progress, the leads dried up. The case went cold and remained unsolved for 2 whole decades. When the case was finally cracked, the truth proved far more sinister than anyone had anticipated. So, who was responsible for the heinous crime? And how did the case ultimately find its long-awaited resolution? Inez Elizabeth Wooten Deaton came into this world on September 16, 1957. While many details of her life remain unknown, Inez was the type of person who got along with everyone. By 1979, she had built what seemed like the perfect family life. Residing in Harris County, Texas, she was happily married with a 2-year-old daughter. However, fate had a tragic turn in store for her. On May 23, 1979, Inez went to a neighbor's house to use the phone. The neighbor suggested she go next door to Winona Bible's home. Winona had been Inez's close friend for years, so she didn't think twice about it. The neighbor saw her enter Winona's house, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. 4 days later, on the Sunday morning of May 27, 1979, the Harris County Sheriff's Office received a chilling call. A man reported discovering the bloodied body of a young blonde woman on the north slope of Greens Bayou at Homestead Road, near an abandoned car wash. This area was known for its murky backwaters flowing west toward Houston. Harris County Homicide Detective Ronnie Phillips was among the first responders to arrive at the scene.
She had a yellow shirt on, said expensive but worth it. She had blood on her face and had a pair of panties on one leg that looked like been ripped off the other leg, you know.
The victim was found without pants, and her underwear had been partially torn from her body. Her corpse showed clear signs of a violent assault. Stab wounds and bruises marred her head. The state of her body suggested she had been attacked. Physical evidence indicated that her killer had dragged her to the location and then arranged her body with her legs spread apart. The victim was soon identified as Inez Deaton. The autopsy painted a grim picture of the gruesome murder. Inez had suffered a total of 11 stab wounds, 9 in the chest and 2 in the back, inflicted by a sharp object. Despite their small size, these entry wounds proved fatal, as they pierced her heart and lungs. However, instead of the conventional knife, the murder weapon turned out to be something more unusual, an ice pick. Although bodily fluid from an unknown male was found on Inez's body, the limitations of DNA technology at the time meant it offered little in the way of evidence. However, samples were stored in the hopes they would be used in the future. With few leads to follow up on, Detective Ronnie Phillips decided to begin his investigation at the very place where it all began, Winona Bible's home. On May 28, 1979, Winona received an unexpected call from the Sheriff's Department regarding Inez. She was completely unaware of what happened to her friend.
What has Inez done now? Is she in jail or something, you know? But she was always pulling practical jokes. And he said, no, she's dead. And it floored me.
Despite her dismay and shock, Winona cooperated with the police and provided details of the events leading up to Inez's murder. She revealed that Inez was supposed to visit her on the day of her death. However, Winona forgot about the arrangement and spent the day out with her family. The only person present at the Bible home during this time was Winona's cousin, 27-year-old Danny Paul Bible. When questioned by detectives, Danny claimed that Inez never showed up at the home.
He seemed cool and collected, you know. He didn't seem upset or anything. He didn't raise no red flags.
However, those who were closest to Danny had a different perspective when they saw the police interviewing him. In their eyes, there was a lingering suspicion that he might have been involved in the murder.
It was a gut in my stomach that kept telling me he did it.
On May 30, 1979, Inez Deaton was laid to rest, and the entire Bible family attended her funeral, except for Danny Bible. Interestingly, shortly after his conversation with the police, Danny abruptly left town. Although his sudden departure raised suspicions, the police lacked any concrete physical evidence against Danny, so they could not pursue him any further. With no other viable suspects, the investigation stalled and the case grew cold. Over time, Danny faded into obscurity, and it would be 2 decades before the case saw any significant developments. On November 7, 1998, Detective Randy Walker of the West Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office responded to a call regarding an assault at a motel in West Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. According to the report, a woman named Tara Robinson was staying in the motel with her boyfriend. When the doorbell rang, Tara's boyfriend went to answer it, encountering a guest from a neighboring room. After a brief conversation, the visitor left, and Tara's boyfriend also stepped out, leaving Tara alone in the room. A little later, a doorbell rang again, and Tara, assuming it was her boyfriend, opened the door to find the same guest from earlier. Before Tara could react, the man forced his way into the room, grabbing her and choking her. He then proceeded to remove her clothes, throw her onto the bed, and assault her. Throughout the ordeal, he gave her repeated warnings while Tara tried to fight back.
The more noise she made, the more forceful he got. If you cooperate, I'm not gonna hurt you. If you keep hollering, you're gonna force me to do some stuff I don't need to do.
Despite initially assaulting her, the assailant grew increasingly frustrated when he encountered difficulty maintaining arousal. Sensing an opportunity, Tara tried to bluff, telling him that her boyfriend would return soon and that he needed to leave. Enraged, he proceeded to bind and gag Tara before attempting to stuff her into a duffel bag. In the midst of this, she managed to break free and call for help, but in the meantime, the intruder fled from the scene. As Detective Walker visited the room where the assailant had been staying, he encountered the attacker's stepson, who was playing Nintendo alone. Eventually, the stepson provided a picture of his stepfather.
So we was able to get a picture right away and show it to her, and she said, "That's him, that's him."
The man turned out to be none other than Danny Bible, now 47, who was once again on the run. However, this time detectives wasted no time in tracking him down. Within days, he was apprehended in Florida and returned to Louisiana for questioning. While Walker believed they had sufficient evidence to charge Bible with aggravated assault in Tara's case, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't Bible's first brush with the law. Bible's reckless and desperate actions during the attack hinted at a darker past, prompting Walker to suspect that there may be more than initially met the eye. He had no idea that his instincts were about to be proven tragically correct.
He just stared at me, and I just kept staring back. And it seemed like for an eternity, but finally he grabbed a cup of coffee and took a swallow of coffee and swallowed real hard and says, "Tell you what, if you get me a Bible and a pack of cigarettes," he said, "I'll talk to you tomorrow."
Walker left Danny with the Bible and a pack of smokes. When he returned the next morning on December 16, 1998, Danny was ready to talk.
And I said, "Ready to cleanse your soul, huh?" He says, "No." He says, "Ready to tell you some of it." I said, "Well, that'll work. That's a start, ain't it?"
He quickly confessed to the attack on Tara and then delved into the chilling details of his life. According to him, his crime spree began way back in 1979 with his first murder.
I said, 1979. I said, "You know who it was?" And he thought, and he says, "I think she was a Deaton, but I'm not sure."
Danny claimed he was home alone watching TV when the girl showed up at his door.
So she comes in the house and you're in the living room, dining room area. What, did any conversation take place? I don't remember any conversation. You know what she came to the house for? Nothing. Tell me what happened then.
He admitted that the moment he laid eyes on her, he made the decision to kill her for no apparent reason.
Did you kill her? Yes, sir.
He assaulted and strangled her before callously stabbing her with an ice pick to ensure she was dead. Then he meticulously cleaned up the crime scene and stashed her body in the trunk of his car.
I can see blood on the side of her neck. I can remember grabbing some bags and placing her in the bags and taking her to a car.
He recalled driving to the bayou's edge and dumping her lifeless body where it would later be discovered. After murdering Inez Deaton, he fled to Montana and Wyoming. Over the next 2 decades, Danny spiraled into a life of extreme violence. He entered into an abusive relationship with a woman, unleashing his fury on her regularly. In one horrifying incident, he wielded an axe and attacked her vehicle while a 3-year-old child was inside, all because he didn't approve of her haircut. Another time, Danny ruthlessly pressed his knee into her ear, delivering such a fierce punch to her face that she required stitches. He then escalated the violence by dousing her vehicle in gasoline and setting it ablaze. Despite enduring years of torment, the woman finally summoned the courage to leave him, unable to bear the constant onslaught any longer. Yet Danny, undeterred, continued on his path without hesitation. After that relationship ended, Danny relocated to Montana for a while, where he continued his spree of criminal activity, including aggravated kidnapping, theft, and assaults. Despite his actions, he managed to evade the grasp of the law. His already unpredictable behavior took a terrifying turn upon his return to North Texas in 1983. Settling in the city of Weatherford, Danny's disturbing actions would soon wreak havoc on the community. Nobody, not even Danny himself, could fathom the depths of his depravity. One fateful day in 1983, while cruising around Palo Pinto County, just west of Fort Worth, Danny spotted Pamela Hudgens, the roommate of his sister-in-law, Tracy Powers.
You were riding around, and you saw Pam walking on the side of the road, and you were driving in your van, and you picked her up. Is that correct? I was coming from work, and I saw her walking, and I picked her up.
The journey turned into a nightmare as Danny began attacking Pamela, ultimately taking her life. Satiating his twisted desires, he callously hung her lifeless body from a roadside fence before fleeing the scene. But it seemed Danny's thirst for blood was far from quenched. On that very same day, he arrived at Tracy's apartment where a heated argument ensued. In a fit of rage, Danny violently grabbed and shoved Tracy, who was holding her son, Justin, causing them both to tumble down the stairs. Tragically, neither Tracy nor her son showed any signs of movement or response after the fall.
What was her condition at that time? Was she saying anything? Was she moving? No, sir.
After the murder, Danny grabbed an ice pick from the kitchen, but he said he couldn't remember what he did with it. He admitted to putting Tracy and her son's bodies in a container and dumping them by the side of the road between Weatherford and Mineral Well. Then, reverting to an old habit, he skipped town and hightailed it to Montana after news of the disappearances spread, and all 3 victims were reported missing. Even upon returning to Montana, Danny showed no signs of laying low. Here he continued his rampage, repeatedly assaulting a young girl and kidnapping another young woman. His freedom, however, didn't last long, as the Palo Pinto County Police closed in on him and arrested him in 1984. On August 3, 1984, Danny Bible pleaded guilty to the murder of Pam Hudgens, as well as a robbery for 2 separate crimes. He received sentences of 20 and 25 years in prison, respectively. However, he was not charged with the murders of Tracy and her son, due to insufficient evidence. Despite being convicted, Danny was paroled in 1992 after serving only a portion of his sentence. During this time, parole for violent offenders was prevalent in Texas due to strict prison population limits mandated by U.S. District Judge William Wayne. Unfortunately, the loopholes in the legal system allowed this monster to roam free, even though he clearly posed a constant threat to society. After getting out, he assaulted 5 of his nieces over and over again in the back of a converted bus in San Jacinto County, northeast of Houston. In 1996, he moved to Louisiana. Danny never stuck to a single place for too long and was always taking odd jobs. This helped him remain undercover and thus escape the gaze of the authorities while continuing his criminal activities. During his 2-year stint in Louisiana, he continued his reign of terror, preying on vulnerable victims whenever the opportunity presented itself. Then, without a second thought, he resumed his life as if his heinous acts were of no consequence. At one point in his life, Danny even formed a family, including a wife, son, and daughter. However, his violent temper and involvement in illicit activities drove them away, leaving him all alone again. His criminal lifestyle was too overwhelming for the detectives. Once the interrogation in Louisiana was concluded, the detectives wasted no time reaching out to their counterparts in Texas. By December 18, 1998, Texas detectives had Danny's confession to Inez's murder in hand, and it was their golden ticket to bring him to justice and put him where he belonged. With that, the curtain fell on the 20-year crime spree of this horrific serial killer, whose notoriety would stem from his peculiar choice of murder weapon. Considered the worst of the worst, Danny Bible was convicted of capital murder by a jury in June 2003 and sentenced to death. But the road to the execution chamber wouldn't be smooth sailing, much like the fate he dealt to his victims. During his transport back to Texas, a twist of karma struck. The van collided head-on with another vehicle, resulting in the death of the officer at the wheel. Though Danny survived the crash, he suffered severe injuries, leaving him wheelchair-bound and with limited use of his arms for the rest of his days. Danny's attorney, Jeremy Shepherd, saw an opportunity to save his client's life and appealed to cancel the death penalty. They argued that Danny's deteriorating medical condition rendered him incapable of posing a danger in his current state. However, their arguments were swiftly overruled. When these strategies failed, the defense attorneys proposed an alternative approach. Given Danny's health problems, they contended that administering a lethal injection could result in a botched execution. They suggested alternatives like a firing squad or suffocation with nitrogen. Despite their efforts, the court rejected all claims. Though the legal battles prolonged the process for several more years, they couldn't alter Danny's fate. Finally, on June 27, 2018, nearly 40 years after his first murder, justice was served. At 66 years old, Danny Bible was led to the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas.
A Texas death row inmate known as the Ice Pick Killer, who confessed to 4 murders and at least 9 rapes, has been put to death.
After all the fuss about his ailing health, the insertion of the IVs went without apparent complications. He gave no final statements, but as the lethal drug started to take effect, just muttered, "Burning, it hurts." Then, 3 minutes later, the Ice Pick Killer was gone from this world for good. Though Inez's family didn't attend the execution, relatives of 2 of Danny's victims watched it from an observation room adjacent to the death chamber. One of them was Larry Lance, the brother of Pamela Hudgens. He would release a statement later through a spokesperson.
Danny Paul Bible is as vile and evil a person that has ever drawn breath. We're glad to have witnessed him draw his last breath. I know that he will burn in hell for eternity.
Let's hope that society never sees the rise of another individual capable of such horrific acts.
In the front room, there were 2 victims lying on the floor. In an adjoining bedroom, there was a small victim in the middle of the bed.
There was maggots. The floor was, when you walked, I mean, you know, they were crunching underneath your feet.
Alan Michael Rubenstein, a resident of Louisiana, owned a small cabin in Summit, Mississippi, which he used to visit with his family for weekend getaways. Around November 5, 1993, Rubenstein dropped off his stepson, 24-year-old Daryl Perry, Daryl's wife, 20-year-old Evelyn Ann Locke, also known as Annie, and their 4-year-old daughter, Crystal Perry, at the cabin. While Rubenstein returned home sometime that day, Daryl, Annie, and Crystal were supposed to return a few days later after having spent some quality time together. When Rubenstein made his way back to the cabin on December 16, 1993, he found the bodies of Daryl, Annie, and Crystal with maggots feeding off them. Who could have committed such a horrible act? Was it a pre-planned murder, or did the family of 3 fall prey to a heinous monster? While on the outside, Rubenstein and his family appeared to be an ideal happy family living in New Orleans, Louisiana, things were not always as they seemed. Daryl had been facing challenges finding a stable job due to his regular misconduct that frequently landed him in prison. And since he would frequently end up behind bars for months, his wife Annie met an African-American male friend named Sidney Page. Rubenstein was not happy seeing his stepson and his family struggling, and so, when Daryl was out of prison in November 1993, Rubenstein suggested that he, Annie, and Crystal spend some time together at their Summit cabin to work things out. They all agreed and decided to go ahead with the plan. On the morning of November 5th, 1993, just before the family left for the cabin, Annie met with her best friend, Sue Bello. Sue was sad to watch her best friend leave, but Annie promised that she would be back for Sue's birthday on November 16th, 1993. On November 5th, 1993, Rubenstein drove Annie, Daryl, and Crystal from New Orleans to the cabin in Mississippi and left them there without a vehicle, promising to pick them up on November 16th, 1993. While there was no telephone at the cabin, Annie somehow managed to make a call to Sue on November 11th, 1993, where the two friends discussed how they would celebrate Sue's birthday. Annie said that it was only a matter of 5 more days and that she would be back in no time. However, Sue's birthday, November 16th, passed, but Annie, Daryl, and Crystal missed the celebration. Sue learned that they never returned from the cabin. Annie's mother, Zula Locke, also grew concerned when several weeks passed and she hadn't heard from her daughter. A little after Thanksgiving, Zula, who was worried sick, called Rubenstein and requested for directions to his cabin. Rubenstein told her that he too was planning to go see them and that she could ride with him to the cabin the next day. However, Rubenstein canceled the trip and rescheduled it for the following day, but then canceled again. Zula was growing worried with each passing day. Whenever she called Rubenstein asking for directions to the cabin, Rubenstein would tell her that she would not be able to find the cabin on her own, as it was in a very secluded area. A few more days went by, and Rubenstein's family decided to visit the cabin on December 16, 1993. When he arrived there, he found Annie, Daryl, and Crystal's blood-covered bodies inside the cabin. Rubenstein immediately called the Pike County Sheriff's Department and informed investigator Donald Lindley about the chilling tragedy. When the detectives arrived at the cabin, they found the bodies of Daryl and Annie in the front room and Crystal's body in an adjoining room in the bed. There were maggots all over the place, and because of that, the bodies had severely decomposed. Later, Rubenstein was asked to visit the Summit Police Department, where he underwent an interview conducted by Pike County Sheriff C.V. Glynis. As per Sheriff Glynis's post-interview notes, Rubenstein disclosed that around November 6, 1993, he drove Daryl, Annie, and Crystal from New Orleans to the cabin. Daryl and Annie asked him to leave, as some of Annie and Daryl's friends were expected at the cabin soon. They made it clear that his presence was not necessary. Rubenstein also told Sheriff Glynis that on November 16, 1993, Daryl made a call and talked to Rubenstein and his wife, Doris, to schedule a pickup. Days later, on November 27, 1993, Rubenstein arrived at the cabin and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Although Rubenstein usually carried his keys to the cabin with him, that particular day he had forgotten to do so. Sean, who was a next-door neighbor, told Rubenstein that Daryl, Annie, and Crystal were in New Orleans. However, when Rubenstein went back to New Orleans, the 3 of them were not there. Rubenstein said that he didn't think too much into it. And then when he returned to the cabin on December 16, 1993, he discovered the bodies. Towards the end of the interview, Rubenstein told Sheriff Glynis that he might know who could have killed Daryl and his family. He told Sheriff Glynis about Sidney, Annie's boyfriend from the time Daryl was behind bars. During this time, while Annie was away with Sidney, having a romantic time, Rubenstein and Doris would take care of Crystal, as they didn't want her around Sidney. According to Rubenstein, she had started to call Sidney her stepdaddy. Rubenstein hated Sidney and didn't hesitate even a little bit while making racist remarks towards him during the interview. Once the interview was over and Sheriff Glynis walked Rubenstein back to his car, all of a sudden, Rubenstein slammed his fist on top of the car and stated that he was afraid that Sidney might have assaulted Crystal before murdering her. Dr. Emily Ward, a medical examiner, carried out the autopsy on Annie, Daryl, and Crystal's body. She confirmed that Annie had died of multiple stab wounds. She had 8 stab wounds on the chest area, including 2 lethal wounds to the left lung. Dr. Emily didn't find any evidence of defensive wounds on Annie's body. Just like Annie's body, Daryl's body was in an advanced state of decomposition. His body had multiple stab and slash wounds, one of which was a very deep 7-inch slash wound across his neck, but unlike Annie, Daryl did try to fight back. There were 3 other wounds to Daryl's arms, which indicated defensive posturing during a struggle. Daryl had 4 lethal stab wounds, 2 to the chest and 2 to the abdomen. Due to the extreme decomposition of the bodies, no blood samples were taken. However, urine samples indicated that both Annie and Daryl had nicotine, caffeine, and acetaminophen in their systems. While making a report on Crystal, Dr. Emily stated that Crystal's death was caused by strangulation, and the hemorrhage in the neck of Crystal's body confirmed this. A few strands of hair were found under her body and were determined to be those of a Caucasian. It was estimated that the murders were carried out around November 16, 1993. Equipped with this information, detectives made their way back to the cabin and questioned people around to learn if they had seen anything suspicious at the cabin. Gail Jackson, who lived next door to Rubenstein's cabin, told the detectives that she never saw the Perrys with a vehicle and that they had no telephone in the cabin. Throughout the 4 to 5 week period preceding the grim discovery of the bodies on December 16, 1993, Gail neither spotted the Perrys nor other people at the cabin except Rubenstein. And considering that Annie, Daryl, and Crystal were fully dependent on Rubenstein for food, money, and transportation, Gail assumed that Rubenstein was only there to help them out. But there was something else that Gail found quite suspicious. She noticed that during this whole time, the same lights constantly stayed on in the cabin. Another neighbor stated that sometime around November 16, 1993, she saw a green van in the area of the cabin. Detectives did follow up on that lead, but they could find no further information about the van. Even after additional efforts, they found themselves at a dead end. Roughly a week and a half prior to the discovery of the bodies, Gail asked her son, Krishan, to head over to the cabin and check on the Perrys. However, when Krishan knocked on the door, nobody answered. Then, on December 16, 1993, when Rubenstein showed up at the cabin, he informed Krishan about the discovery of the bodies. Officer Glenn Allen Applewhite, a criminal investigator for the Mississippi Highway Patrol, was looped in on the investigation by the Sheriff's Department. Based on what Sheriff Glennis learned from his interview with Rubenstein, Officer Applewhite and his staff focused their investigation on Annie's boyfriend, Sidney Page. On January 5, 1994, Officer Applewhite spoke with Rubenstein and his daughter Tanya at their home in Louisiana. Tanya confirmed that she saw Daryl and Annie on the night of December 2, 1993, at a local bar named Mudbugs. On January 12, 1994, investigators tracked down Daryl's brother, David Perry, thinking that he might know a bit more about who might want his brother dead. David met with the detectives at Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office and told them that if they looked hard enough, they would find an insurance policy somewhere in the Perry's killings with connections to Rubenstein. And soon, when detectives managed to get their hands on the insurance records, they discovered that a little more than 2 years before the murders of the Perrys, Rubenstein took out a $250,000 life insurance policy on his step-granddaughter. Rubenstein was now a potential suspect in the Perry family killings, and the insurance policy was an ample motive for the crime. To learn more about this policy, detectives got in touch with George Heine, an insurance agent for New York Life in Louisiana. George testified that sometime in December 1990, Rubenstein had contacted him to discuss taking out life insurance policies on his grandchildren. The application date for Crystal's $250,000 policy was September 13, 1991. According to the insurance policy, Doris, who was Crystal's blood relative, was the owner and first beneficiary. Rubenstein was the second beneficiary, and Annie and Daryl were the third beneficiaries. David also provided detectives with some crucial information which cast more suspicion on Rubenstein and the story he told during the initial interview with Sheriff Glennis. In contrast to what Rubenstein told the detectives, Daryl claimed that Rubenstein didn't go to the cabin on November 27, 1993. According to Daryl, Rubenstein visited the cabin on November 16, 1993, and confirmed he spoke to him about the visit just the next day. If this piece of information was correct, it would almost place Rubenstein directly at the crime scene, since the coroner estimated that the killings took place around November 16, 1993. Detectives decided to sit down with Rubenstein for another interview and confront him with this new information.
Rubenstein At that point, they asked if he was a suspect, and when I asked him, can you give me your activities on the 16th and 17th of November, he invoked his right to attorney, and the interview ended at that time.
Rubenstein immediately hired a lawyer and went silent, since there was no other way to confirm whether Rubenstein went to the cabin on November 16, 1993. The investigation seemed to be slowly reaching a halt. Officer Applewhite continued looking for more evidence, but he could find no fingerprints, DNA, or blood samples which could link Rubenstein to the crime. With a lot of suspicions, but no physical evidence tying Rubenstein to the crime, prosecutors didn't have a strong case against Rubenstein to take before a grand jury, and so they decided to get more information about him. Detectives called in Annie's boyfriend, Sidney Page, for an interview. Sidney told the detectives that he met Annie sometime but only got involved in a serious relationship with her in 1991. He and Annie stayed together for about 8 months while Daryl was locked up behind bars. And during this time, Crystal was being taken care of by Rubenstein and Doris. He told the detectives that Rubenstein harbored deep hatred for African Americans, and he especially hated him for having relations with Annie. But this wasn't only because of Rubenstein's dislikement toward Sidney. Rubenstein also had sensual feelings for Annie. Shedding light on the dark relationship Rubenstein had with Annie, Sidney told the detectives that since Annie and Crystal were fully dependent on Rubenstein financially, Rubenstein would often ask Annie for intimate favors in return whenever Annie would ask him for money or even to see her daughter. Further confirming these claims, Annie's best friend, Sue, described an episode where Annie needed $30 to get a present for Crystal on her birthday, and when she called Rubenstein to ask for the money, he told her what she had to do. Annie hung up the phone and cried. Another one of Annie's best friends, Kay Kelly, told the detectives that the relationship between Rubenstein and Annie was not strictly father-in-law and daughter-in-law. Rather, it was an intimate relationship with Rubenstein holding the reins over it. Describing a past incident as an example, Kay said that one time when Crystal had chickenpox, Annie had no money to buy a lotion for her. When Annie asked Rubenstein for money, he forced Annie to sleep with him first and then handed her the money. Apart from that, Kay also told the detectives that Rubenstein repeatedly requested her to sign a statement saying she saw Daryl and Annie between November and December in 1993 in New Orleans. Kay testified that she never saw them, but Rubenstein pressured her to make this false statement. While all this information was crucial to the case, it still didn't prove that Rubenstein was involved in the murders of Daryl, Annie, and Crystal. The investigation went on, but led nothing of much importance to the case. On January 26, 1994, Doris and Rubenstein signed a claim for the $250,000 proceeds on Crystal's policy and received the funds on April 13, 1994. From then onwards, years went by with no developments in the investigation. The case went cold. Sometime in 1998, detectives approached Dr. William Bass, who studied the process of human decay and decomposition on the campus of the University of Tennessee in a place known as the Body Farm.
In 1980, I started a facility in which I would put bodies out under various conditions, clothing, no clothing, sun, shade, and record what happened and how long it took for various changes in the body to occur.
With 40 years of experience with corpses, Dr. Bass had become the world's leading expert on determining how long someone had been dead. Hoping to provide his expertise in the Perry murders, he agreed to help the detectives, but he presented them with one condition.
Dr. Bass, at the beginning of the conversation, told me, "I do not want you to tell me when you think these people died."
When people like that call, what I try to do is to tell them, I will tell you as accurately as I can how long those individuals have been dead.
Bass reviewed pictures of the crime scene and autopsy photos from December 1993 and felt pretty confident that the Perrys had been dead at least 1 month before those pictures were taken. Looking at the photographs and the amount of decay the bodies had been through, Dr. Bass stated that Daryl, Annie, and Crystal had been dead for somewhere between 28 and about 34 days from the day their bodies were discovered. To confirm these findings, Dr. Bass began studying the bugs which had infested the body and that was when he encountered a problem. Dr. Bass explained that one of the major factors in decay was the first critters to be attracted to decaying bodies were the blowflies. Within the first few hours of death, blowflies would swarm over a dead body and lay eggs, which would later hatch and become maggots. For up to 2 weeks, those maggots would mature and grow, and eventually seal themselves up in tiny shells called the pupa cases. And about 3 to 5 days later, those pupa cases would open and maggots would re-emerge as flies. Dr. Bass again examined the pictures of the Perry family from the crime scene, this time looking for pupa case peels left after the metamorphosis. This would confirm that the whole 17 to 19-day process had run its course and confirm the timeline of the events, which eventually helped detectives determine whether Rubenstein was involved in the murders or not. However, Dr. Bass didn't find any such pupa case peels in the pictures. Even though the case was still weak, this was still sufficient evidence for the detectives to make an arrest. In September 1998, Rubenstein was indicted by the Pike County Grand Jury and captured in Louisiana. Rubenstein was extradited to Mississippi and housed in the Pike County Jail. There, Rubenstein met an inmate named James Stevens. Over time, the two became friends and started sharing details about their crimes with each other. Rubenstein trusted James and eventually gave him a full confession on how he carried out the murders of Annie, Daryl, and Crystal. James testified that initially Rubenstein had planned to hire somebody to kill Daryl, Annie, and Crystal, but later he changed his mind and decided to do it himself. A few days after dropping the three at the cabin in Mississippi, on November 16, 1993, Rubenstein went back to the cabin and stabbed Daryl and Annie to death. James said that Rubenstein did not specifically say how he killed Crystal, but it was either strangulation or choking or suffocation. He left the bodies in the cabin and left for New Orleans. Later in December, Rubenstein went back to the cabin. The bodies were still there in the same places. His granddaughter was on the bed. Daryl's eyes were gone. There were maggots feeding off of him, and Annie had a huge hole in her stomach because of multiple stabs. Additionally, James testified that Rubenstein told him that he only killed his family for the insurance money. And to make the crime scene look like a robbery, Rubenstein planted 2 kilos of cocaine in and around the cabin. However, those drugs were never found. Rubenstein was indicted by the Pike County Grand Jury for the capital murder of Crystal while engaged in the commission of felonious child. His indictment also included counts for the murders of Annie and Daryl. Rubenstein's trial initially took place in 1999. The trial went on for 12 days. However, it resulted in a mistrial after the jury failed to reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial for Rubenstein took place in February 2000. This time, Dr. Bass was present too. He sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as the state medical examiner gave testimony. And as photos from the autopsies flashed over an overhead screen, Dr. Bass noticed a picture he had not seen before. The picture was a close-up of the head of 4-year-old Crystal Perry.
When she got up to show her slides, this was something that Bill Goodwin didn't know about, or nobody knew about really. She's showing the slides of the bodies in the morgue, and in the little girl's hair, you could see pupa cases.
In the middle of the state medical examiner's testimony, Dr. Bass rose from his seat and asked the judge if he could examine the photos. Once done, Dr. Bass took the stand once again.
We pointed out on the defense's picture that, hey, this is what we've been looking for.
The new photos put to rest any doubt about time of death, and Rubenstein's fate was now sealed. At the end of the trial, the jury convicted Rubenstein on all 3 murder charges. On February 5, 2000, the jury, along with handing out 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment for the murders of Annie and Daryl, sentenced Rubenstein to death for the capital murder of Crystal. Rubenstein's post-trial motions were denied, and he planned to appeal this court, calling the trial unfair and stating that all the evidence against him was hearsay. In October 2009, while still on death row, Rubenstein was handed a new sentence, 3 consecutive life terms instead of the death penalty. The Mississippi Supreme Court had overturned the death penalty, citing the original trial judge's failure to adequately instruct the jury on sentencing options. Despite the opportunity, relatives of the victims chose not to attend the hearing. Rubenstein himself also opted not to address the court during the proceedings. Annie, Daryl, and Crystal now rest in peace, laying side by side at West Lawn Memorial Park and Mausoleum in Louisiana. Do you think Rubenstein had planned these long ago in 1991 when he signed up for that $250,000 policy for Crystal? Do you think Daryl knew about the abusive relationship his stepfather, Rubenstein, had with Anne?
On March 31, 2023, a fisherman in St. Petersburg, Florida, came across something horrific. He noticed an alligator carrying something big in its mouth. He felt something terrible might be happening, so he called for help. Soon, officers arrived and found out that the alligator was actually biting onto the body of 2-year-old Taylen Mosley. This shocking discovery happened at Dell Homes Park, 13 miles from where Taylen's mom, 20-year-old Passion Jeffrey, was found dead the day before. How did the body of baby Taylen find himself in the mouth of an alligator miles from home? Was this an accident, or was there something more sinister at play? Let's find out. On the evening of March 30th, 2023, Lakita Denson attempted to FaceTime her 20-year-old daughter, Passion Jeffrey, just like every morning. They had a routine of talking to each other daily, a habit that brought them closer despite their physical distance. Passion's great-aunt, Theo Brickhouse Salas, also eagerly awaited their morning conversations. But on this particular day, their calls went unanswered, sparking concern. 2-year-old Taylen Mosley, Passion's son, was accustomed to seeing his mom during her work break as she came back home. He was also eagerly waiting for her call, yet they never came. The following morning, Lakita continued to call Passion, hoping for a response, but all attempts to reach her daughter failed, leaving Lakita and Theo deeply worried. Sensing something amiss, during her work break, Theo decided to visit Lincoln Shores apartment complex, where Passion worked. What she found was shocking, a trail of blood leading from the parking lot to Passion's apartment door. Despite multiple attempts to reach Passion, there was no answer. Theo's concern grew, prompting her to seek assistance from an apartment staff member. Together they entered the apartment, only to be met with a scene of horror. Passion lay lifeless in the bathroom, surrounded by signs of a violent struggle, and Taylen, her beloved son, was nowhere to be found. Bloodstains marked the walls and floors, revealing the horrific struggle that had taken place. Also, the absence of Taylen raised an alarming question: had he been abducted? The urgency to find him followed, overshadowing the need to understand what happened to Passion. Police rushed down to the Lincoln Shores apartment complex, launching a massive search for Taylen. Their primary focus was to ensure his safety and well-being. An Amber Alert was issued, alerting the community to Taylen's disappearance and mobilizing law enforcement agencies and the FBI across the region. The next day, on March 31st, a breakthrough came in the most tragic of circumstances. Liddell Golden, a fisherman at Lake Marjorie, had made a horrific discovery of an alligator with a small object in its mouth. Upon closer inspection, it became clear that the object was the lifeless body of Taylen. On March 30, 2023, following the discovery of Passion's body and the disappearance of her 2-year-old son Taylen, 21-year-old Thomas Mosley, Passion's ex-boyfriend, became the primary person of interest. Matter of fact, in the weeks leading up to that day, life seemed normal for Passion and her family. The family said they last saw Jeffrey and Taylen the evening before, around 5:30 p.m., when Jeffrey hosted a birthday party for Thomas. Both Passion and Taylen had been staying away from Thomas for a while, and there was a clear reason for this. You see, 20-year-old Passion had a great future when considering her career achievements. She attended Northeast High School, where she overcame significant challenges to graduate with honors in 2021. Passion's journey to graduation was marked by the added responsibility of motherhood as she became pregnant during her junior year, giving birth to her son Taylen Mosley on October 23, 2020. In her graduation photo, she proudly held Taylen, symbolizing her determination to succeed despite the obstacles. Meanwhile, her then-boyfriend, Thomas Mosley, built dreams of a career in rap music, which he pursued instead of seeking stable employment to support Passion and Taylen. Undeterred by Thomas's choices, Passion remained steadfast in her dream to build a better future for herself and her son. At just 20 years old, she secured full-time employment at a local CVS pharmacy, showing her commitment to providing for her family independently. With her hard-earned income, Passion was able to secure a new apartment in the Lincoln Shore complex, a significant source of pride for her as she embarked on this journey of self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, Taylen was described as an affectionate and caring 2-year-old, affectionately known as Tay-Tay, who brought immense joy to Passion's life. Despite the challenges posed by Thomas's reluctance to secure steady employment, Passion remained optimistic about their family's future. As the last person to be seen with Passion and Taylen after his birthday party on March 29, 2023, investigators sought to locate Thomas immediately. There was a glimpse of hope that Thomas had taken Taylen somewhere safe, and whatever had happened to Passion occurred in his absence. Thomas's mother's house, just a short drive away, was one of the places investigators considered Taylen might be. Upon tracking Thomas down at St. Andrew's Hospital, investigators discovered knife cuts on him, which was different from the typical defensive wounds seen in attack victims. But despite attempts to question him, Thomas remained tight-lipped and requested legal representation. With Taylen still missing and Thomas refusing to disclose his whereabouts, the urgency to find himself intensified. Meanwhile, in the St. Petersburg area, search teams used helicopters, drones, and ground crews to look for Taylen. The whole community joined in, spreading Amber Alerts and asking for help to find Taylen. Investigators searched everywhere, checking canals, lakes, and dumpsters, hoping to find any clue about where Taylen might be.
Our two most important things right now is number one, to find Taylen and bring him home, and number two, to find out who killed Miss Jeffries. That's our main goal right now. This is all hands on deck. Every detective is working this case. I just briefed the mayor prior to coming here. I want to thank our partners that are out there. Number one, the St. Pete Police, the St. Pete Fire Department, the Clearwater Fire Department dive team. They're here. The Sheriff's Office, Pinellas County, for bringing their aviation unit out here. Manatee for bringing out the K-9. Our partners at FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the FBI. So as you can see, everyone here is working on this case.
On March 31st, there was terrible news. A fisherman named Liddell Golden found Taylen's body in an alligator's mouth in Lake Marjorie, about 13 miles away from the scene his mother was found murdered. Despite their best hopes, the outcome was not what anyone desired, and Thomas was arrested in connection with the murders. The affidavit released following his arrest revealed disturbing details about the crime scene. Passion had been mercilessly stabbed around 100 times. Taylen's cause of death was yet to be determined pending examination by the medical examiner. The evidence against Thomas was quite substantial too. Bloody footprints found at the scene bore Gucci logo, suggesting the perpetrator wore Gucci shoes. Additionally, a cleaning product bottle with bloody fingerprints matching Thomas's was discovered, indicating an attempt to conceal evidence. Further exploration uncovered Thomas's Instagram account, where he operated under the pseudonym T-Smoke. This alias allowed him to evade media attention, explaining the scarcity of public images. One photo from about 18 weeks ago depicted Thomas wearing Gucci slides, recognizable for the distinct logo imprint, which could have left traceable marks if worn during the crime. Also, Thomas's decision to seek medical attention immediately after the crime was noteworthy. It implied the severity of his injuries, possibly deterring immediate arrest or interrogation by law enforcement. His hospitalization until Friday, despite being named a person of interest, suggested significant injuries that hindered his ability to flee. Thomas's apparent lack of effort to evade capture further supported this theory, suggesting a disregard for the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, an officer's observation also suggested that Thomas may have had mental health issues that raised questions about his psychological state. Legal experts weighed in on the case, indicating that the evidence against Thomas Mosley was strong. They suggested that a trial could result in a conviction for first-degree murder. Given the overwhelming evidence, defense options seemed limited. On October 11, 2003, Thomas Mosley faced serious accusations of murdering both his 2-year-old son and the child's mother. The tragic incident has led prosecutors to pursue the death penalty against Mosley, who has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in relation to the deaths. Despite the gravity of the charges, Mosley's attorney entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. Furthermore, Mosley's competency to stand trial is under scrutiny, with a reevaluation scheduled for April 2024. This assessment will determine his mental fitness to participate in legal proceedings. The outcome of this evaluation could significantly impact the trajectory of the case and Mosley's legal defense moving forward. In the meantime, the community came together to support Passion and Taylen's family during this difficult time. Messages of sympathy and solidarity poured in from across the city, offering comfort and solace in the face of an unimaginable loss. Meanwhile, Passion's family grapples with the devastating loss, struggling to come to terms with the unimaginable suffering inflicted upon their loved ones. Their anguish remains palpable, compounded by the gruesome details of the crime revealed in the autopsy report and photographs.
He's always calling his mom on his cell phone.
Yep, always.
He misses mom. They call each other all the time. She really loves Taylen.
As the case progresses, the family hopes for justice, seeking closure and healing amidst the ongoing trauma.
We just want to say that Taylen is a beautiful little boy. And he's really loving and caring. I want people to remember them as 2 kids who absolutely loved each other.
A GoFundMe account was set up in the name of both Passion Jeffrey and Taylen Mosley. While it may take years before the trial concludes, they remain determined to see Thomas held accountable for his actions and to honor the memory of Passion and Taylen. Back in 1975, on the day of January 7th, the neighborhood of the Howard Johnson Motel in Fulton County, Atlanta was stunned with a terrible murder. 50-year-old Samual Milton Guy, who was a decorated officer of the law, was shot to death in the middle of the night. On that fateful night, Guy was moonlighting as a security guard for the motel. While on duty, he saw 2 men trying to rob the cashier and decided to confront them. But as fate would have it, he was shot in his shoulder and thigh in the middle of the confrontation by one of the armed individuals. Unfortunately, the assailants fled without any trace while Samuel Guy bled out on the floor. To make matters worse, these runaway assailants would remain free for a long time to come. Guy was rushed to the nearest hospital, but the gunshots had severed Guy's femoral artery, leading to heavy external bleeding. Sadly, he passed away, leaving behind his wife Francine and his son David, who was also a police officer.
Sam was an extremely good detective. He was a fine man. We all up here, of course, his son works up here in North Fulton. We all looked at him sort of the fatherly type too. We all looked up to him, seeked his advice. He's just a fine detective. There's no words to express the goodness in Sam Guy.
Just so well liked, and he was sort of like the neighborhood hero everybody looked up to, you know, and especially when he became a policeman.
Guy was a respected member of the community who had served in the military for over 2 years between 1943 and 1946. His son, alongside the police department, wanted to waste no time in starting a full-fledged investigation. They spread across the neighborhood. However, there was not a single clue that could solve the case. The only few pieces of information they had was that the assailants stole $275 from the cashier, stole Guy's gun, and that the shots were made from a .38 caliber handgun. But all this information meant nothing without a connection in between. Additionally, when a sudden incident occurs with no apparent connection between the perpetrator and the victim, it becomes much more challenging to solve. The investigation went on for 6 months. However, no new information came to light. Moreover, the bullets recovered from the scene matched with no samples that were related to a crime. Later in the same year, a new suspect came to light. Out of nowhere, a man named Harold Wiley confessed to the murder of Samuel Guy, and that should have been the end of the case, right? However, Wiley's account was not considered legit due to his psychological issues. the case went back to square one. With no more evidence, the case went cold, leaving behind just a blind hope for justice.
I felt that maybe one day I would be able to be involved in the apprehension of these people.
Even though the investigation hit a dead end, Guy's son, David, refused to give up. In 1982, FBI Special Agent Arthur Krinsky, a member of the fugitive squad, contacted David with crucial information. He informed David that an informant had tipped him off, naming Terry Jackson and Abner Wilkinson as the men who shot Guy. This revelation was significant. However, as David continued his investigation, he was asked to step back from the case due to his emotional involvement. Despite David's continuous pressure to keep the investigation going, the rest of the department felt that there was not enough evidence to pursue this lead, and unfortunately the case was kept on the shelves for many more years to come. However, as fate would have it, 23 years after the murder, on September 29, 1998, an unexpected phone call would totally change the course of the once considered cold case. On the other line of the call was a woman who wanted to remain unknown, but she told the detective that she knew who shot Guy.
I really felt like this was not some crackpot. This was somebody that knew what they were talking about. And she gave the name of Abner Wilkinson as being one of the perpetrators, and an individual that she knew only as TJ.
Cold case detective Jim Rose and Scott Bennett traced the call back to the woman who was identified as Myrtle Wilkinson, Abner Wilkinson's estranged wife. And so it was time to pay Myrtle a visit.
Can you tell us a little bit about that night?
I saw it on television, on news. But he told me before I saw it, told me right after it happened.
She said that after the crime had occurred, the morning after, that her husband Abner had come home and had more or less told her about it, what had happened, and then told her, we're not going to talk about it anymore.
Myrtle also confided in them that she was in fear of her husband, so she kept quiet for so long. But now, one of the perpetrators was brought to light. All that was left was to uncover the accomplice.
And can you tell me the name of the person that was with him? Do you know his full name? Just TJ?
And she knew TJ only as TJ was somebody that her husband and that she socialized with from time to time.
However, you might already understand that TJ is none other than Terry Jackson, and this indeed confirms the claims made by David in 1982. So, obviously, it was time for the detectives to contact David.
Mickey Lloyd called me and said, I just want you to know that something's happening on your dad's case.
Now, a retired Fulton County deputy sheriff, David tried to get to the end of it.
I said, well, do you have any names? He said, well, yes, we, Abner Wilkinson, and then all we have is initials, TJ. And I said, Terry Jackson.
He said TJ is Terry Robert Jackson. Whoa, how do you know this?
Well, had they believed David's claims in 1982, the case would have been over a long time back. However, now with Myrtle's statements, the case file had become stronger than ever.
It was basically the same as the information we had initially in 82, so I was certain at that time that they were on the right track. What made me feel good was when I spoke with Detective Rose and Sergeant Bennett. I knew that they really wanted to solve this case for the family, you know.
Detective Rose and Bennett then took a long drive to take out a confession from Abner Wilkinson. And if you're wondering why they chose to meet Abner Wilkinson first, then this is the answer.
Abner had been arrested a few times, but there was no strong violence in his arrests. He was the one that was possibly the weaker of the two. So we decided to start with Abner.
But the two detectives didn't dive straight into it. They wanted to create momentum by spreading rumors in Wilkinson's neighborhood about police inquiring about a murder.
I wanted his neighbors to go to him, and I wanted his friends to go to him, and I wanted his family members to go to him and tell him that the police department was looking for you.
And their plan, it worked like a charm.
Out of the blue, he'd run into somebody that said, hey, these two Atlanta homicide cops were here asking questions about you. And in the end, it proved to be more than he could take.
On September 17, 1999,
Wilkinson confessed to his crimes, revealing that he and Terry Jackson had decided to rob the hotel to get money as they were addicted to the drug. Wilkinson admitted that he was tired of carrying the guilt of being part of a crime for many years. Therefore, he agreed to turn state witness and explain the details of the incident.
It seemed like they were like in hot pursuit. And I came to the conclusion that maybe I'll just go and get it off my chest.
He had arrived carrying an overnight bag, so I think he knew that it was time to face the music and go ahead and put this thing behind him.
Wilkinson stated that he held the clerk at gunpoint while Jackson went to the back of the lobby. According to him, this prompted Samuel Guy to start firing, and Wilkinson began firing back as well.
And we were going to make the announcement. The officer got up and pulled his weapon. And he and I were, I was ducking behind the pillows and, back and walked on through the lobby, and he came back and shot him in the leg. For no reason, he didn't like shoot him in a vital area, And he said, y'all get bad, But I didn't know that he was going down.
Jackson then instructed Wilkinson to throw the weapon out, and Jackson himself took Guy's pistol.
Spending most of the day with Abner, videotaping his story, talking to him, going over the finer points, I really felt like we've got it. Now it's all that's left to do is go arrest Terry Jackson, which we did that night.
Wilkinson's testimony was backed up by a man named Larry Smith, who revealed that he had met Jackson on the day of the incident, and Jackson told him how he had to come down on a security guard. Some prosecutors deemed Smith highly reliable because his record was remarkably clean. Interestingly, Smith was the informant in 1982, confessing his knowledge of Jackson and Wilkinson's involvement in the case. Myrtle also claimed that her ex-husband's friend, TJ, was the other man beside Wilkinson at the Howard Johnson motel during the shooting. Wilkinson struck a plea deal with the authorities. In court, he pled guilty to reduced charges and testified that he and Terry Jackson killed Samuel Guy during the robbery. In accordance with the deal, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 2002. However, on April 9, 2011, Abner Wilkinson reportedly passed away at the age of 75 in Atlanta. On the other hand, Terry Jackson was sentenced to life in July 2002 after being found guilty of 2 counts of robbery and 1 count of malice murder. However, in August 2002, Jackson filed for a new trial, arguing that the 24-year gap between the crime and his indictment in 1999 deprived him of due process of law. He also claimed that the trial was biased against him because a key witness had apparently passed away during that time. Jackson amended the motion in April 2003, but the appeal was rejected in June. According to reports, all his subsequent appeals have also been rejected. As of today, Terry Jackson is serving his sentence in a correctional facility in Atlanta. As justice prevailed, Detective Jim Rose was assigned with Samuel Guy's badge number. On April 10, 1936, 2 upholsterers walked into a house to deliver a couch to their client in Manhattan, New York City. The duo, an apprentice and his boss, noticed that the door of the apartment was unusually open. After a little hesitation, they decided to move inside and keep the couch indoors. Little did they know that they walked right into a scary crime scene when they found the dead body of their client in the bathroom. She lay face down in the bath. Her clothes were viciously torn to shreds. What ordeal took place in the house that led to the woman facing such a horrific end? Was the door of the apartment already unlocked, giving access to the killer, or did the killer rush out of the place, leaving the door open in their tracks? The boss, Theodore Kruger, and his assistant, John Fiorenza, immediately called the police. On being questioned, the duo said that since they couldn't simply drop the couch and leave, they chose to walk further inside and look for their client, Nancy Titterton. That was when they stumbled upon her dead body. Nancy Titterton was a short story writer. She was a young 34-year-old lady who was quite popular for her fiction writing skills. Born on April 16, 1902, she had started writing short stories for several magazines, some of which soared high in popularity with the New Yorkers. While working at the New York Times in the 1920s, the Ohio native fell in love with an Englishman, Louise Titterton, whom she married in 1929. Later, her husband was promoted to an executive at the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, while she had also risen to the position of an editor at a publishing house. Nancy loved reading and writing, especially stories of the murder mystery genre. She had started a publishing company named the Crime Club Incorporated and had also received an offer to write a book. The cruel murder of a known and celebrated personality stirred an uproar in the social circles of New York City, making the mystery-loving author the subject of her own homicides mystery. The New York City Police Department called Louis Titterton and informed him of his wife's killing. They asked him if he knew anything and when was the last time he had spoken with Nancy. Louis recalled that everything was pleasant when he left the house for work around 8 a.m. and had also called Nancy for a quick conversation at 9 a.m. The police spoke to Louis's coworkers and confirmed his story, clearing him off the list of potential suspects. On further investigation, police found that a friend of Nancy's had called her around 10:30 a.m. The friend informed the cops that Nancy was in a good mood and was looking forward to the upcoming Easter weekend. The Tittertons were planning to host some friends and family for Easter, and thus they needed their couch to be repaired and reupholstered. With this information, the police determined that the crime took place between 10:30 a.m. and noon when the couch was delivered. Nancy was strangled to death, but the killer did not use his hands to kill her. The police found a small piece of rope in the bathtub, which was unlike the usual ropes available in the marketplace. The police also found that Nancy's wrist had rope marks, showcasing she was tied before she was attacked. The marks on her body and the torn state of her clothes led the police to conclude that she was assaulted before being killed. The investigation of the crime scene showed several mud stains on the bedsheet of Nancy. However, the police found the most vital clue to her murder without looking any further. A single long strand of hair lay on the bed, which on analysis was determined to be horsehair. This was a rather peculiar, as well as a very unexpected discovery. The only source of horsehair in a posh Manhattan apartment could have been the stuffing of the freshly reupholstered couch of the Tittertons. But if the workers never entered the bedroom, how did the strand of hair make its way to the crime scene? Were the workers really innocent, or did they raise an alarm after committing the crime? Although Theodore and John had reported the crime, they had also become the initial suspects of the cops. The police questioned Theodore Kruger and John Fiorenza about their whereabouts when the crime took place. Theodore, the boss, said that he was at his shop and was working on the couch. John said that he was at the shop as well, and Theodore vouched for him. The police went to the upholstery shop to verify their claims and found that while Theodore had multiple alibis, nobody had really seen John at the shop. The police did have the horsehair to connect it to him, but it wasn't concrete enough to pin any charges on him. The NYPD switched their focus to the unique piece of rope they had discovered and tried to locate its source. While the police were looking into the rope, they found a dab of green paint in the house. On inquiring among the residents of the building, it was unveiled that the building was getting repainted with the same color. 4 painters were commissioned for this work. However, only one of them was present on the day of the murder, whom many residents had spotted working diligently. Thus, the suspicion over the painter wore off as quickly as it had formed. Finally, the cops found the source of the rope. The item was manufactured by New York's Hanover Cordage Company, which also sold a batch to the upholstery shop of Theodore Kruger. Thus, the rope that had tied Nancy's hands before her assault and murder had now tied the killer to the crime scene and Nancy's murder. Were the workers of the furniture repair shop lying after all? The police had conclusive evidence to look more into the profile of John Fiorenza. After rummaging through police files, they found that John already had a criminal record, something he had not revealed to the police before. John's record showed 4 accounts of theft for which he had served a 2-year prison sentence before. He was also formally evaluated by a psychologist while serving his sentence and was diagnosed as a delusional person. While the police knew they had their man, they chose to be more sure before arresting him. John was brought to the station for questioning. He told the police that he didn't know Nancy too well and that she was just a client. However, the police made it seem like they needed his help for the investigation. They won his confidence and got more information out of him. Then they showed the rope and the horsehair found in Nancy's apartment in front of him, catching him off guard. This was an unexpected turnaround for John, who later confessed to his crime and narrated everything to the police. John said that he saw Nancy for the first time on April 9, 1936. When he went to her apartment with his boss to pick up the old couch, he said that it was love at first sight for him. The next day, John showed up at Nancy's apartment early, saying he needed a few more measurements. Later on, he said he confessed his love to her, which she promptly rejected. This made John very furious, and he decided to force himself on her and kill her. For strangulation, he used the pajamas Nancy was wearing when he had attacked her. The killer said that he had ensured that he didn't leave anything behind, but Nancy's dead body played a vital role in cornering him, as it hid a piece of the rope under it. John thought that pretending to have discovered the body with his boss would have saved him, but as fate would have it, the horsehair had already attached itself to John's clothing to convict him for the murder of the high-profile author. During his trial, he pleaded that he was insane. However, the jury refused to believe him and ruled that he was guilty of assault and first-degree murder on May 28, 1936. He served a brief sentence in prison, after which he was executed via electrocution on January 22, 1937 in Sing Sing, New York. Nancy Titterton was a bright and amazing writer who had just begun her dream journey of becoming a published novelist. She had just set up a new company and was sincerely working on the biggest project of her life while living with her loving husband. Sadly, she met a tragic demise before her dreams could take off. However, the mystery author did help the police find out who her killer was. Thus, she died while solving the puzzle of her own murder.
On the seemingly ordinary day of July 24, 1981, siblings Jeff and Jenny awaited the arrival of their 39-year-old mother. However, as the hours had passed by, Charlotte never showed up. Concerned for the safety of their mother, the siblings had called the Clark County Police, notifying them that something might have happened to Charlotte.
How am I going to find my mom? She could be alive out there somewhere.
Where did Charlotte disappear to, and why were her children afraid something might have happened to her? Owning one of the largest farmland in Clark County West, 42-year-old Fred and 39-year-old Charlotte Grabbe operated over the 800-acre farm all by themselves. The couple met around 1956 and started to date soon after. Their relationship ended up in an early marriage, which went on for 23 long years. They had 2 children, an older son named Jeff and their daughter Jenny, both in their early 20s. Starting a family at the early age of 15 brought down young Charlotte with more problems than she could have imagined. The couple had issues settling in, and heated arguments were a part of their daily routine. The children had grown up shielding their mother when they saw her facing the brunt of the numerous arguments with her husband. Fred was a big guy, standing about 6 feet 4 inches and weighing 280 pounds. Along with his tough look, the man had always donned an intimidating persona. If the fights weren't bad enough, the rumor of Fred's extramarital affair had become well known among locals. The news of a local bartender, Vicky Jane McAllister, and Fred's summer fling had soon hit home.
She attended bar. Her reputation was not of the purest.
Charlotte had previously once gone through a divorce due to the raging conflicts around 1961, but it barely lasted for a year before the couple again remarried the following year. The arrival of Vicky had changed everything for Charlotte. She couldn't endure the amount of shame her husband had brought to the family and had kicked him out the moment she heard the news. Fred left his home and family, followed with a divorce in hand. Despite being kicked out, he had decided to move out to a small cabin, which lay within their 800-acre farm property. Jeff and his wife, Cindy, had moved in with Charlotte soon after. They wanted to make sure their mother was fine and was being taken care of. Charlotte would spend most of her time out in the field and come in at sundown. But suddenly, a deadly fate struck the Grabbe family. On the night of July 24, 1981, Charlotte Grabbe had disappeared without a trace from her own residence. She was out on the farm just like her usual days, but this time didn't return home after.
Getting worried, Jeff and Cindy had gone out to the field to look for Charlotte. The couple had headed to the machine shed, where the tractor was kept, and found Charlotte's uneaten lunch over its wheels, along with her migraine medications. The medications were a longtime companion of the 39-year-old, and she never went anywhere without them. The concerning scene was enough for them to call up the authorities. The sheriff of Clark County, James Red Thompson, reported to the site of the disappearance, and after close inspection and interrogation of the couple, they headed to where Fred was. He lived within close distance to the shed, were sent missing, and giving their history, the authorities had their bets on him as a probable suspect. The man clearly stated he had nothing to do with his ex-wife's disappearance. He claimed that he was back in his cabin that morning when Charlotte came in for a quick visit. Fred had apparently engaged in a verbal argument with her, after which she took off in her car towards the highway. 2 days later, on July 26, 1981, authorities found Charlotte's car, abandoned outside the border in Terre Haute, Indiana. There was no evidence of a struggle, with no signs of where Charlotte could have been. The only concerning fact was a handgun found underneath the driver's seat. Although it was most likely being kept for personal safety, it begs the question, what could have pushed Charlotte to think she might need to take such drastic measures to protect herself? Soon, authorities had gotten a call from Charlotte's bank, informing them of a lockbox which she had accessed 10 days before her disappearance. The lockbox contained handwritten letters, mostly regarding Fred. In the letters, Charlotte expressed her fear and suspicions towards her cheating husband. In them, she shared he might be stealing farm equipment, and most of them addressed his violent behavior towards her. The letters had confirmed the suspicion Sheriff Thompson had towards Fred. However, they weren't enough to implicate him in Charlotte's disappearance. Authorities brought down Charlotte's family members to ask about the letters. Jenny, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter, would finally open up about chilling details to her mother's married life. She had disclosed a grim detail on how the couple tied the knot. When her mother was barely 15 years of age, she began dating the then 19-year-old Fred Grabbe, who physically took advantage of her, resulting in a fixed arranged marriage. Charlotte was pregnant with Jeff when she was only 17. The startling beginning of the couple's life was enough to raise doubts on the tragedy that was about to come. Charlotte had faced great difficulties in her marriage, tolerating serious physical abuse. Fred had been accused of being abusive towards his family on many occasions, leaving not only his wife, but beating up the kids as well.
My brother and my dad were fighting physically, and my dad even took my brother by the side of the head and beat his head into the fender of the pickup.
Fred had always hated the fact that his children always took their mother's side, and even once accused Jeff of hiring a gunman behind his back. The deranged thoughts that Fred surrounded himself with often brought out an uncontrollable and spiteful side to him. The remarriage in 1962 had worsened things for the family, especially for Charlotte. The fights grew more aggressive by the day, and so did her fears. She could slowly sense that she was no longer safe in the presence of Fred. What was even more shocking was that she had even told her children that if she ever were to go missing, the one responsible would be Fred. Like a deadly prophecy, on the night of July 24, 1981, Charlotte Grabbe went missing only miles away from her house without a single trace. Jenny's statement, followed by the letters left by Charlotte, confirmed Fred to be the lead suspect, but Sheriff Thompson still lacked any concrete piece of evidence which could confirm Fred's involvement in the disappearance. The authorities had no way to move forward without evidence. The letters solely cannot confirm Fred's involvement in the case, and Charlotte was still missing without a trace. A few days had passed, and one of Charlotte's friends turned up at the station, stating she had witnessed Fred following Charlotte's car on the highway the day she went missing. What she revealed added another sick twist to this tale. The woman behind the wheels of Charlotte's car wasn't her, but instead was a blonde woman, Vicki Jane McAllister. Authorities went down to Vicki's bar and had brought both her in along with Fred for further interrogation. Vicki was asked whether she had met Fred on July 24th or went anywhere close to the farm where Charlotte was. Both she and Fred defended each other, almost identically, stating they knew nothing. During the whole investigation, Fred had been asked by his children multiple times to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence, which he had up front refused. The interrogation and other possible leads quickly dried out, causing the case to shut down within a short span. For the next 4 long years, Charlotte's family and children would yearn for any news to learn what had happened to their mother. Reward posters were sent out by the family in hopes of getting any information. Even a large sum of $25,000 was announced for anyone with information about Charlotte. However, even that did not bring any results. As a last resource, they had turned to private investigator Charles Pearson for help. Charles began his investigation by tracking Vicky down and found that she had been living in Indiana. He had followed her from a distance and slowly made himself into a close acquaintance of hers. After earning her trust, Charles came clean about leading Charlotte's investigation and asked Vicky to reveal anything that might help. The woman, much to his surprise, held back nothing. The impending guilt of keeping a dark secret had been eating her from the inside for years, and she confessed to every detail. Vicky said that not only she was driving Charlotte's car to the border, she had also witnessed her murder. On the unfortunate day of July 24, 1981, she and Fred were already present at the machine shed when Charlotte had arrived. She caught her ex-husband and Vicky together in the shed, causing a vicious fight between them. Vicky had watched from a distance as Fred towered over his petite wife as he strangled the life out of her.
Vicky McAllister told us Fred actually choked Charlotte several times and then would let up on the pressure and let her regain consciousness and then would choke her again, making comments to her the whole time.
The haunting, torturous end to Charlotte's life was met with an even more horrifying fate. According to Vicky, Fred had taken a grease gun and assaulted her lifeless body before stuffing her in a 55-gallon barrel. He then loaded the barrel onto the back of his truck and instructed Vicky to follow him in Charlotte's Ford LTD, parked right outside. They had driven down to Terre Haute, Indiana, where they dumped Charlotte's car and Vicky went back to Fred's truck. They had returned back to the farm and had parked near an area next to the Wabash River. Fred had placed the barrel beneath a maple tree and filled it up with gasoline. Charlotte's bodily remains were burned while the pair watched the scene from a distance. The case was reopened in 1985 based on Vicky's testimony, but without evidence, they couldn't charge Fred with the murder. The Clark County Sheriff Red Thompson had now retired, and the case was handed over to Sheriff Dan Crumrin. Sheriff Dan had asked for a forensic investigation around the maple tree where Charlotte had allegedly been burned. Forensic teams from the University of Illinois sent in biologists to run a search on the maple tree. According to Vicky's statement, Charlotte's body was burned on the specific section by the base of the tree. There were only 2 side branches of the maple tree which got affected by the fire, causing the remaining other sections of the tree to lie unharmed. In court, Heimlich and Dickerson, the organic chemist working over the case, were able to prove physical evidence to Charlotte's murder. They testified that the tree's growth in 1981 had been stunted by the presence of a petroleum product that had reached its roots and some of its branches. The samples taken from the tree's 5 main branches supported Vicky's testimony about on which side of the tree the burning drum had been placed. 3 of the branches showed no damage, but the 2 that had been over the drum were clearly damaged. The court trial against Fred Grabbe finally began with the sample evidence. Vicky was given full immunity and rewarded with grant money for her testimony in Charlotte's case. Fred Grabbe's murder trial took place before a Vermilion County Circuit Court jury in Danville, where he was sentenced in June 1985 to natural life in prison without parole. Just as the Grabbe family had assumed that their misery had come to an end, tragedy struck again. On March 22, 1966, a mere 6 days before Fred's second trial, Jeff Grabbe's body was found on Seal Beach in California. Somebody had shot him twice in the head and once in the chest and had weighed his body down with an anchor. But over a period of weeks and strong tides, the anchor had shifted and the body floated to the surface. Seal Beach police say that the killing appeared to be drug-related. However, no arrests were made due to the lack of evidence. The second trial for the murder of Charlotte Grabbe began on March 28, 1986. In the meantime, while Fred was being held in the Clark County Jail, he had made a miserable attempt at running away from the cell with the help of his new girlfriend, Barbara Graham. It was about 1:45 in the morning on July 7, 1985. The Marshall Police Chief John Treffs was on duty when Barbara approached him, saying she wanted to deliver a love note to Fred. When John had opened the door, she shot him in the leg and held him at gunpoint. Graham had fired 4 of their shots, one of which tore through the uniform trouser of Deputy Sheriff Davison. Marshall police had rushed into the jail and helped subdue Graham. Barbara Graham, 26, a twice-divorced mother of 3 from a nearby town, was sentenced to serve 16 years in prison. The trial ended on April 12, 1986, when the jury announced Fred guilty for the second time. And on August 2nd, Fred was sentenced to 75 years in prison, not becoming eligible for parole until the year 2022. 34-year-old businessman Gary Kergan was one of the richest men in Baton Rouge, Louisiana during the 1980s. The inseparable Kergan brothers, Gary and Ted, had built their Sonic Drive-In franchise from scratch. However, fate took a grim turn on the night of November 28, 1984, when Gary was nowhere to be found. The search for Gary turned into a full-blown investigation that ran for 2 long, treacherous years, during which the police and Gary's family looked out for every possible lead. How could a person of influence go missing without a trace? What enemies did Gary make along the way, and what secrets hid behind the closed doors of the reputed Kergan family? Gary Kergan was married to Susie Alma Muir and lived with his only son, Wade. The couple got married on December 12, 1972 in Warren Township, Michigan, United States. After 12 years of marriage, a successful chain of Sonic Drive-In franchises with close-knit loyal business partners, Gary was at his peak by mid-30s. After losing his dad at a young age, his younger brother Ted looked up to him as his guardian. With larger-than-life dreams, they both had big plans for the company. Gary had planned to negotiate a development agreement with Sonic to build a chain of restaurants in the New Orleans area. This proposition was way ahead of its time, but Larry Tucker bought it. Larry, who was a dear friend to Gary and now his business partner, planned on buying a bunch of stores in the Baton Rouge area together. On the tragic night of November 28, 1984, Gary had received a call from Ted. He had been able to secure all the fundings from Mississippi to launch their project. Gary had hit his first milestone in business and was out to celebrate the night of his life. He had plans to meet over at Ted's place to celebrate their success with his brother. The booze and food had piled up for the night, but the doorbell never rang. As the night grew dark, Ted kept waiting for his brother to turn up, but he never showed. Upon receiving the news of her husband's sudden disappearance, Susie rushed over to the nearest police station to report him missing, while his brother Ted tried calling everyone he knew to ask if there was any sign of Gary. There were no signs of him at any of their usual restaurants, and Larry confirmed that the last call they had was to inform that he's coming over to Ted's house. Canvassing through every square inch of Baton Rouge, the family went to every possible place they knew. The Baton Rouge Police Department was already out with their officers to search through the entire city. Both Gary and his brother were fully commissioned deputies with Acadia Parish Sheriff's Department. The sheriff was quite familiar with the brothers and had looked over the case personally. The investigators combed through Gary's apartment, turning it upside down, but managed to find only one single piece of evidence, a torn-up sheet of paper in the trash can with the name Erica on it. The chit was found in a shared apartment in Baton Rouge, which raised the suspicions towards Larry Tucker. Larry said that he found the crumbled-up paper while cleaning the apartment and had thrown it in the trash as it hadn't struck him as something important. This unknown woman had now turned the tables in the investigation, with doubts starting to revolve around the devoted father and husband Gary Kergan. Who was this mysterious woman, and what was her connection to the case? The search for Erica took Ted and the officers to a strip club named the Hot Spot. Officers had asked around if anyone had seen Gary there last night. One of the dancers said he had been there, and sure enough had left the place with one of the dancers named Erica. Her license application revealed her actual name to be Layla Mullah. Being just 19, she worked at the joint as a stripper and a hooker while living in a scrappy duplex with her boyfriend, Ronald Dunnigan. He was her pimp and in charge of most of her business. Almost double her age, Ronald had connections to some of the richest men in town. Layla Mullah came from a wealthy family, but fate had led the troubled Ohio runaway to a life of neon lights and stripping on the seediest corners of Baton Rouge. But the unconventional relationship between Layla and Ronald had an even darker side to it. It seemed that Gary Kergan had been their latest target. Pramila Burns, a former prosecutor with the East Baton Rouge Parish District Attorney's Office, revealed that Gary was a regular at the strip club and shared a close relationship with Layla. On November 2, 1984, cops hightailed it to the duplex where Ronald and Layla lived.
I started to think that, maybe Gary's in there and he's tied up in a closet and, maybe he's in some kind of distress.
There, the officers would make a horrifying discovery. The scene at the apartment was nothing short of a bloodbath. There was no trace of the couple, or indeed Gary, but the walls and entire floor was painted red in blood and bodily remains. It looked as if someone had ruthlessly smashed a body with a hammer. Gary's brand new Cadillac had been left outside in the business parking lot for the last 5 days. The car was tainted with blood and made the suspicion towards Layla and Ronald even stronger. While forensics at the time was still years away from testing DNA samples, the possibility of Gary Kergan being the victim seemed high. The investigators had attempted to establish a timeline of assault. They deduced that the attackers first hit him in the trunk of his car and later dragged him to the apartment. Susie, who had been clinging to the last bit of hope that her husband would return, now felt helpless. The police had an entire crime scene laid out in front of them, with the perpetrators on the loose. Another alarming factor that added to the mystery was no evidence of the murder weapon was recovered from the scene. Gary Kergan certainly looked the part when we picture a wealthy businessman. With flashy outfits, jewelry, and a fancy car, he was adorned with money and quite an easy target for the deadbeat boyfriend and Layla. The prime suspect in the case, escort Layla Mullah, was the last known person to be seen with the missing businessman. An alert was sent out to every police station for any sighting of Layla and her boyfriend, and it was not long before the runaway couple was found. In the busy city of Las Vegas, Layla strolled into the sheriff's office all by herself. She had decided to run back to her old business and went down to the sheriff's office in Vegas to get her escort license renewed. There she was cuffed right at the station while Ronald was waiting outside.
What a stroke of luck that she goes to sign up for this license and
She goes to the police. She literally walks right into our arms.
The police had no circumstantial evidence to hold Ronald, and apart from a bench warrant for non-paid traffic ticket, he was squeaky clean. The Vegas police were doing their best to hold him down at the station. While the Department of Louisiana dove into their investigation, the team headed out to the couple's recent residence in Vegas, and in doing so, stumbled upon the best piece of evidence they had found up till this point. Inside the kitchen drawer was Layla's diary, along with a notebook filled with revealing entries. The entire crime was pre-planned till the very last page, with the diary sharing Layla's deepest secrets.
I get to a point in the diary close to when Gary disappeared where she says, "Hit Gary next time, Ron will hide in the closet, that good man."
when you read that, did you feel ill or did you feel like, oh my God, I have them?
My blood just went cold.
The diary had the records of each and every event, from how she had stumbled upon Gary to how she and Ronald executed the plan. The plan described in the diary was to poison Gary's drink when he came to meet with Layla, and after the two had gotten intimate, Ronald, who would be hiding in her closet, would wait to strike at the right time. As Gary would be choking on his wine, Ronald would jump out and suffocate him by shoving a pillow over his face. However, the actual crime scene the police had found seemed much more violent than what they had initially planned. This raised the pressing question of what had happened in the apartment that had caused such a bloodbath. With enough circumstantial evidence to get the duo behind bars, police brought Ronald and Layla back to Baton Rouge, as the district attorney's office was ready to pounce on them. The police were sure that with the bloody crime scene and diary entries, it would be an easy and straightforward arrest. But the case took a different turn. Gary's body was still missing, and without a victim, technically there was no case to present to the court. Hence, the East Baton Rouge court attorney had no choice but to release the prime suspects in 1985. The case was assigned to a new district attorney, Brian Bush, who took over after former assistant prosecutor Pramila Burns in 1984. With DNA extraction and technology still being miles from where it is today, developing a profile from the blood at the crime scene was beyond comprehension. Having no means of identifying the blood and testing for DNA residue, Layla and Ronald managed to free themselves from the grasp of the law, walking away without facing any consequences. The biggest hurdle in the case was Layla Mullah. The woman proved to be rather cunning and had kept her hands clean while Ronald allegedly did the dirty work for her. She was charged as an accessory, and without her testimony, the murder charge against Ronald wouldn't hold up. The woman refused to testify against Ronald and was offered immunity to walk away from prosecution. With Layla's lips sealed, Ronald also walked out of the parish jail as a free man. Both Layla and Ronald would go on to spend the next 3 decades of their life together, with the investigation into Gary's case going cold. In the year 2015, the case found a new ray of hope with the introduction to New Age forensics. The newly funded cold case unit of the Baton Rouge Police Department had approached old cold cases to reevaluate them, and in doing so, stumbled upon the Kergan file. Fate seemed to smile upon the Baton Rouge Police Department as the case got appointed to District Attorney Investigator Memory Tucker, who turned out to be the son of Gary's beloved business partner, Larry Tucker. The forensic team had collected DNA samples from Wade, Gary's son, which proved to be a genetic match with the blood found at the scene of the crime, having shown father-son genetic relationship. On September 9, 2015, the cold case of Gary Kergan had its first hearing. Layla Mullah had eventually moved to New York with a nursing degree, while Ronald had drifted back to his corner in Louisiana and lived on his supposed disability check. As Layla was interrogated for the assault and murder of Gary Kergan, her first response was to play the victim. She blamed Ronald and accused him of blackmailing her, saying how he had forced her into the line of escort work just to extort money out of a 19-year-old. When investigators brought out the diary entries, Layla's demeanor instantly changed and she became defensive.
You met Gary at the
met
club.
him a few times at the club.
Mm-hmm.
Dunnigan was always talking about, getting someone further money.
See, on this journal entry, you have planned to get him next time. Von hid in the closet, that good man. He said, let's see, I had $240 from Sonic Gary.
Okay, I don't remember how much money.
Do you remember writing that?
No.
What do you think you were referring to there?
I don't know.
After a while of intense questioning, she finally broke and confessed to what happened on the night of November 28, 1984. Layla shared the entire plan.
It's true about the wine. It was tainted. Dunnigan was hiding in the closet. And Dunnigan drug him out of the room.
We need to know why he went into the
He
bathroom.
cut him in half, okay? It was foresty. It was a green dumpster. I remember there were lights though, so I know it wasn't a rural area.
Layla was sentenced with 30 years of imprisonment, and with the help of her plea deal for testimony against Ronald, the court sentenced him to life in prison. Finally, the 3-decade-long murder mystery of Gary Kergan had been put to rest.
During the 1960s, in the United States, a period of transformation unfolded. The era was marked by significant events such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and a shift in young people's perspectives on their role in society. Alongside these changes, a new wave of feminism emerged as women rejected the traditional roles assigned to them in the 1950s and actively engaged in various spheres of life. Amidst this backdrop, 23-year-old Jane Louise Mixer found herself deeply involved. Jane was a first-year law student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1969. She was an ardent political activist, embracing the opportunities for growth and change that this era presented. At the same time, she had recently become engaged to Phil Weitzman, who was attracted to her intellect, curiosity, burgeoning social awareness, and ambition. Jane's love for Phil burned strongly. As spring 1969 arrived, they both felt ready to announce their engagement. Jane, however, wanted to have a heartfelt conversation with her parents first, before telling them of her engagement. She believed that by sharing her thoughts and feelings, she could persuade them that their union was a positive step forward. Jane formulated a plan where she would embark on the journey home before Phil, who would join her a few days later. With the arrival of March 1969 and the impending spring break, Jane took to a college rideshare bulletin board and posted a note in search of a ride across the state to her hometown Muskegon. Over a telephone conversation with her father, Jane mentioned that she had made arrangements to travel with a fellow student named David Johnson, who had responded to her ride-sharing posting. A few days later, before Jane left home, She also spoke with her sister, Barbara, to let her in on the plan as well. Barbara wasn't on board with the plan of Jane and Phil traveling separately. She suggested that she should travel with Phil. However, Jane was adamant and expressed her belief that it would be more advantageous if they made the journey independently. Barbara still wasn't convinced and voiced her concerns, stating that it didn't seem safe, but Jane asked her to trust the plan. On March 20th, 1969, Jane informed her parents that she intended to depart from Ann Arbor at around 6 p.m. that same day and would arrive in Muskegon by 9:30 p.m. that evening. As the minutes turned into hours, Jane failed to turn up, and her father's worry intensified. Unable to wait any longer, around 11 p.m., he made the decision to venture out in his car, embarking on a search for his daughter. Driven by concern, he tirelessly combed the area, dedicating several hours to the quest of finding any trace of Jane. Sadly, Jane never made it home. On the evening of March 20th, 1969, Jane vanished after accepting a rideshare with a stranger to her parents' house in western Michigan for spring break. The following morning, on March 21st, 1969, a woman from a nearby home noticed a dead body in a graveyard close to her house and promptly alerted the police. Tragically, Jane's life had come to an end in an old cemetery located 14 miles from Ann Arbor. The heartless killer callously left Jane's body exposed on the grave near the cemetery gate. Local detectives from Ann Arbor, Michigan State Police, arrived at the scene at 10:30 p.m. in the morning. The air was cold and crisp, and Jane's body was still lying in the cemetery sprawled on a stranger's grave, having suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head and probable strangulation from a garrote around her neck. In a disturbing display of attention to detail, the killer had lifted Jane's jumper to reveal her underwear, placed a towel under her head, and carefully covered the body with her yellow raincoat, positioning it on top of a grave. The merciless killer had even arranged Jane's shoes and a copy of Catch-22 near the body. Although she had not been assaulted, looking at the condition of her body, the detectives could tell that she had gone through extreme horrors in her last moments. According to the medical examiner, the silk stocking found on the law student's neck had been placed after her death and did not contribute to her demise. The presence of 3 unidentified drops of sweat on the victim's pantyhose and a single drop of foreign blood on her hand served as crucial evidence. With the information at hand, detectives probed an intense investigation into Jane's murder. They started by questioning Jane's friends and family and the people who lived near the cemetery where Jane's body was discovered. Witnesses reported seeing a green station wagon speeding away from the cemetery on the night of the murder, but it was never located. The police conducted a search of Jane's dorm room and discovered a phone book with a mark next to the name David Johnson. However, the David Johnson in question, a University of Michigan student, had a solid alibi. He was performing on stage that night and denied offering Jane a ride. Law enforcement investigated other individuals named David Johnson in the area, as well as Jane's acquaintances. When they spoke to Phil, Jane's fiancé, detectives noticed an emotional detachment in Phil's demeanor. Phil defended himself by simply stating that he was too numb to really care. According to him, he was much more concerned about dealing with the death of someone he was about to get married to. Apart from the evidence found with the body, the police stumbled upon a single clue, a phone book in Jane's dormitory room with the words Mixer and Muskegon written. They suspected that the killer must have written these words, but there was no solid proof. While the investigation was in full swing, Jane was laid to rest at Restlawn Cemetery, Muskegon, Michigan. During the period when Jane was murdered, a serial killer was also at large, leaving a trail of 7 victims by the end of July 1969. The killer's reign of terror seemed unstoppable, and most of his victims went through great horrors prior to their deaths. Young women were being murdered, and despite the efforts, the perpetrator remained on the loose. Such horrific occurrences were not common in the area, and hence local campuses started implementing heightened security measures. Dormitories started to enforce checkout procedures. Eastern Michigan University implemented a curfew for all students, and the University of Michigan expanded its cross-campus bus service and added lights to major streets and walkways. Additionally, campus police had also intensified night patrols to address the growing concern. As the bodies kept on piling up, the Mixer family began losing hope of ever finding the monster that took away Jane forever. However, the community was not ready to give up yet, and demanded action. Over the course of a 2-year period, starting in the summer of 1967, the University of Michigan and Eastern Michigan University in nearby Ypsilanti was shaken by a series of horrifying murders. 7 young women, residing either on or in close proximity to these campuses, met merciless fates, their lifeless bodies left in public spaces as harrowing testaments to the gruesomeness of the crimes. The tragic sequence of events began on July 9, 1967, and lasted until July 23, 1969. It wasn't until the discovery of the 7th victim that the police finally caught a break in the case. On July 31, 1969, law enforcement officials made a significant breakthrough in the case, apprehending 22-year-old John Norman Collins, an outwardly assuming student attending Eastern Michigan University. Collins, characterized by his clean-cut appearance and fraternity affiliation, was arrested in connection with the murder of the 7th victim, Karen Sue Bieneman. Karen, who was described as a cautious and sensible girl, was an 18-year-old freshman from Eastern Michigan University. She had been mercilessly strangled and left on a desolate hillside. To the university students, the arrest came as a shock. John Norman Collins was an education major at Eastern Michigan University and had no prior criminal record. A pivotal moment in the investigation came when a witness came forward claiming to have seen Collins in the company of Karen before her untimely demise. Despite widespread speculation implicating him in all 7 homicides, Collins ultimately faced trial and was convicted for just one, the murder of Karen Bieneman. The prosecution's case against him relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, painting a chilling portrait of the accused's alleged involvement in the tragic events that had gripped the community with fear and disbelief. Although Collins maintained his innocence in Karen's murder even after his conviction, he was sentenced to life in prison. He was never charged with the murder of any of the other 6 victims. Still, people in Michigan breathed a collective sigh of relief as the killings had finally come to a halt. And now that Collins would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the case of the Michigan murders seemed closed. Nonetheless, doubts persisted regarding the potential connection between Jane's murder and Collins, as it didn't quite align with the established pattern of murdering his victims. Jane's killing was different from the established pattern observed in the other cases, where victims were subjected to merciless assaults, beatings, and stabbings, indicative of a physical rage. The circumstances surrounding Jane's murder further added on to this observation. Her body, discovered on March 21, 1969, in a cemetery west of Ann Arbor, showed a deviation from Collins's typical approach. While most of his victims suffered assault, mutilation, and fatal stabbings, Jane had been strangled with a nylon stocking and shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. Despite these discrepancies, there were certain similarities between Jane's murder and some of the other victims. Notably, a woman who was killed 3 months before Jane had suffered a similar fate, being shot with a .22 caliber weapon. She was last seen in the company of Collins on the evening of her death. Moreover, common threads linked Jane's death to the others, which had been connected to Collins. The presence of garrotes, such as the stockings found around Jane's neck, echoed the methods employed in several other cases. Additionally, Jane's abduction near the university building and the subsequent discovery of her body in close proximity to where Collins's other victims were found further fueled speculation regarding a potential link. Investigators conveyed to the media a strong conviction that, although they couldn't definitively establish Collins as the perpetrator behind all the Michigan murders victims, they were confident of his involvement. Over time, the Mixer family gradually came to terms with the belief that Collins was responsible for Jane's death. As a result, a slight sense of relief washed over the community. With Collins already incarcerated, Jane's case was marked as inactive in 1970 and eventually faded, as it was never officially solved. As the years went by, decades slipped away, and the case eventually grew cold. Sergeant Eric Schroeder had long been troubled by Jane Mixer's unsolved murder, which seemed to have slipped through the cracks and been forgotten about over the years. Convinced that justice had eluded Jane, Schroeder felt a deep personal connection to her story. When Schroeder was given the task of cataloging evidence from old cases in 2001, he eagerly seized the opportunity to reopen Jane's case, determined to bring closure to her tragic story. Recognizing the advancements in forensic technology since the late 1960s, Schroeder saw the potential for DNA analysis to uncover new evidence. As a new generation of Michigan State detectives began re-examining old cases for DNA testing, Schroeder was struck by the discrepancies in the evidence surrounding Jane's murder compared to Collins's established habitual way of operating. Among the evidence cataloged was the pantyhose found on Jane's body, which Schroeder promptly sent to a forensic lab for DNA analysis. Forensic scientists meticulously examined sections of the pantyhose for possible DNA traces. Additionally, they examined Jane's clothing, the ligature used in the crime, and a blood-stained towel found beneath her head for any telltale DNA evidence. Roughly a year later, in 2002, Schroeder received an eagerly awaited call from the scientific team. Despite the lengthy passage of time, the lab had managed to unearth crucial DNA evidence. Surprisingly, however, this genetic material did not align with that of John Collins, the man who had been suspected of the murder for over 3 decades. This revelation introduced a new suspect into the spotlight of suspicion. In painstaking detail, lab technicians analyzed residue from 3 distinct drops of indistinct bodily fluid discovered on Jane's pantyhose, alongside a solitary drop of blood found on her hand from pieces of evidence that had been kept preserved over the course of more than 30 years. In the year 2004, the breakthrough emerged from the analysis of the sweat. The genetic markers from the analysis confirmed that Collins was not involved in Jane's murder and instead pointed to Gary Lederman, a retired nurse hailing from southwestern Michigan. He had dedicated his professional life to nursing. To learn more about Gary, the detectives took a closer look into his life. Gary was a 62-year-old resident of Goblaze, Michigan. Described as a bald, stout man with a passion for Civil War history, Gary was a former school board member. He was married to a Filipino woman, and together they had taken in her niece and nephew following the tragic loss of their parents and raised them as their own children. Gary had been a devoted husband for nearly 3 decades. Additionally, Gary and his wife had taken up the responsibility of taking care of Gary's elderly parents and also had generously hosted a teenage exchange student from South Korea. With Gary's involvement in various community activities, including youth sports programs, there were no signs that showed him attempting to evade detection. And even though his slate seemed clean, the test results spoke otherwise. The lab's findings indicated that the DNA recovered from Jane's pantyhose bore a striking resemblance to that of Gary Lederman. While the precise origin of the DNA remained a mystery, the police laboratory confirmed that it neither matched the blood nor other bodily fluid samples, leaving open the possibility of it being sweat, saliva, or skin cells. Nevertheless, the discovery provided law enforcement with sufficient cause to loop Gary into the murder investigation. According to Schroeder, investigators dedicated a substantial period, approximately 2.5 to 3 months, to conduct a thorough background check on Gary. Eventually, they made the decision to reach out to him directly. In the autumn of 2004, Sergeant Schroeder went to visit Gary Lederman at his residence in Goblaze, Michigan. When the police arrived at his doorstep, Gary initially didn't think much of it. At that time, he considered his life to be fairly ordinary and thought that the detectives were just on a routine check. At first glance, Gary appeared to be an unlikely suspect. However, after engaging in conversation with him for over 3 hours, the detectives delivered a stunning revelation. They informed him that his DNA had been identified on evidence from the crime scene, evidence that had remained in storage since 1969. Trying to recall the moment, Gary expressed disbelief and repeatedly questioned the detectives about what was going on. Gary adamantly asserted that he had no acquaintance with Jane Mixer. In 1969, when Jane Mixer was murdered, Gary was a 26-year-old bachelor. Having completed a 4-year stint in the Navy, he resided in a town approximately 20 miles away from Ann Arbor, the town where Jane was murdered. Originally from the outskirts of Detroit, Gary had lived in close proximity to Ann Arbor during his younger years. Following his military service, he pursued a career as a traveling pharmaceutical salesman in the region during the late 1960s. Despite relentless questioning by the police, Gary kept asserting that he was innocent and wasn't involved in Jane's murder. However, Schroeder, unconvinced by Gary's protest, cited the compelling DNA evidence against him. Subsequently, Gary was taken into custody. While he had no prior history of violent offenses, Gary harbored a couple of undisclosed secrets. In 2001, Gary had faced legal trouble for forging a prescription.
During a search of his vehicle, law enforcement discovered a stash of stolen prescription blanks from the Kalamazoo hospital where he was employed. He faced charges of illegally obtaining painkillers, including Vicodin and Loracet, and attributed his actions to a struggle with addiction following a battle with kidney stones. Gary ultimately pled guilty to this crime and agreed to undergo drug rehabilitation. As a convicted felon, Gary was obligated to provide a DNA sample under a newly enacted state law, which took effect just 3 days following his conviction. This DNA test ultimately led to his arrest on suspicion of him murdering Jane Mixer. Upon delving deeper into Gary's background, authorities unearthed disturbing evidence of a darker nature. A search of his residence uncovered explicit Polaroid images of the South Korean exchange student, which showed her in compromising positions. According to prosecutors, the teenage girl appeared to be unconscious, with her clothing manipulated to expose her genitals. Despite this revelation, the girl claimed to have no recollection of the events surrounding the photographs. What was even more suspicious was that the positioning of her attire mirrored that of Jane's when her body was found. As the next step into this new investigation, police conducted interviews with the people who were acquainted with Gary at the time of the murder. One former girlfriend of Gary revealed that he exhibited peculiar erotic behavior. However, the most significant revelation came during discussions with his roommate at the time of the murder, Paul Esper. Esper disclosed to the authorities that he harbored significant suspicions regarding Gary's involvement in Jane's murder. He told the detectives how Gary eagerly awaited the prints of news articles related to the Michigan murders, only to store the clippings in a closet. Moreover, Esper recalled Gary boasting about a particular medication capable of rendering a woman unconscious with a single drop, a substance that he had access to while selling prescription drugs to hospitals. Detectives discovered a vial containing a mixture of Valium and a sedative in Gary's shaving kit, a chemical composition known to induce a deep sleep, bordering on unconsciousness. Furthermore, Esper revealed that Gary had constructed a makeshift shooting range in his basement where he regularly fired his .22 pistol. State records corroborated Esper's account, confirming that Gary had purchased a .22 caliber Ruger revolver in 1967, which he later reported stolen in 1987. Esper recalled that Gary used to insist on Esper using the range, which struck him as suspicious. Additionally, an analysis of Gary's handwriting linked the scribbled note found in Jane's phone book to Gary. Just before Thanksgiving, in November 2004, armed with compelling evidence, police apprehended Gary, and he was taken into custody and held without bail. On July 11, 2005, they charged him with open murder, a charge which could lead to Gary being handed a life sentence. But what could have motivated Gary to commit such a heinous act against a woman? The manner in which her pantyhose was removed and her jumper was pulled up to expose her genitals strongly suggested a motive rooted in assault. Yet despite these indicators, there was a glaring absence of physical evidence to substantiate claims of an assault, adding to the myriad of challenges in this long-standing case. Complicating matters further, crucial evidence such as proof of assault, footprints, and fingerprints were either missing or lost, compounded by the gradual erosion of people's recollections over time. Moreover, the whereabouts of the murder weapon remained a mystery. However, perhaps the most daunting hurdle for law enforcement in providing Gary's guilt in Jane's case was the revelation that his DNA wasn't the sole genetic material recovered from the crime scene. Although the state lab confirmed a match between Gary's DNA and that found on Jane's pantyhose and silk stockings, DNA extracted from a blood spot scraped from Jane's left hand in 1969 pointed to another individual named John Rules. John was a convicted murderer, serving a life sentence in Detroit for an unrelated crime. However, it was confirmed that John Rules was merely 4.5 years old at the time of Jane's murder. How could a 4-year-old child have perpetrated such a violent act? A child of that age could not have wielded a firearm, strangled the victim with a stocking, or arranged her body in the manner it was discovered in the cemetery. The presence of a 4-year-old's blood on Jane Mixer's hand raised perplexing questions. Rules had killed his mother in early 2002, and the evidence from this case was being analyzed in the same lab where DNA evidence from Jane's case was being examined at the same time. The timing of the processing of the Rules and Mixer cases in the lab concurrently raised questions about potential contamination. Sarah Theobald, a lab technician involved in the analysis, clarified that she exclusively handled the man's clothing and never came into contact with evidence from the mixer case. She emphasized that she adhered to strict sterile protocols, working on a sanitized surface and utilizing her own personal tools throughout the process. A few months into 2005, Gary was put on trial for the 1969 murder of Jane Mixer. Throughout the trial, Gary firmly maintained his innocence and claimed he didn't have anything to do with Jane's murder. Despite the gravity of the situation, Gary had unconditional support from his family and friends, particularly from his wife, who communicated with him frequently while he was imprisoned. Meanwhile, Jane's sister, Barbara, along with her daughter, Maggie, attended all court proceedings diligently, determined to assess the evidence firsthand. Barbara emphasized the importance of bearing witness to Jane's life and felt compelled to be present throughout the trial. As the prosecution began to present its case, they called David Johnson to the stand. David was the one who allegedly responded to Jane's note of requesting a ride back home. However, he was involved in a play on the night of the murder and testified that he had no interaction with Jane. Additionally, David said that he was unaware of her existence. Prosecutor Stephen Hiller offered his perspective on the events of that fateful March night in 1969. Hiller believed that Gary posed as David Johnson and responded to Jane's advertisement for a ride to Muskegon. Additionally, Hiller theorized that Jane accepted the ride, and at some point during the journey, Gary made an advance at Jane that escalated into a fatal confrontation. According to Hiller, on March 21, 1969, the night of the murder, Gary put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger twice. Hiller also mentioned the point that Gary owned a .22 caliber handgun, the same type used in Jane's murder. The detectives who had worked on Jane's case when her murder actually took place made earnest efforts to recollect the details of the case, including both the evidence they managed to secure and the unfortunate losses along the way. However, the pivotal turning point centered on a factor entirely unforeseen in 1969, the DNA analysis. Testimony from the fresh team of investigators who had been working on the case since 2001 focused on the discovery of 3 distinct DNA spots found on Jane's pantyhose. According to their assertions, these DNA profiles clearly pointed to Gary. Furthermore, they contended that DNA evidence from other spots on Jane's clothes yielded partial matches, further confirming his involvement. These spots included 3 additional areas on the pantyhose, traces on the blood-stained towel which was found beneath Jane's head, and marks on the nylon stocking that was wrapped around her neck. Hiller argued that the abundance of DNA evidence suggested Gary's presence at the scene of the murder, speculating that he may have been sweating while moving Jane's body. Gary, yet again, denied these accusations, asserting ignorance regarding how his DNA could have ended up in those locations. In his defense, Gary's attorney, Gary Grabbe, suggested several credible explanations. He believed that there were innocent scenarios that could account for the presence of DNA. One of the possibilities suggested by the defense was incidental contact with the pantyhose in a public laundromat. Alternatively, as proposed by the expert witness, DNA transfer could have occurred during a chance encounter in a public setting, such as through a sneeze. Hiller dismissed these notions and argued that the sheer volume of DNA evidence defied innocent explanation. Hiller pointed out that the DNA was found in locations where casual contact would not suffice. He contended that there was no plausible justification for Gary Lederman's DNA to end up on Jane Mixer's pantyhose. Yet Hiller struggled to reconcile the crime lab's discovery, a blood spot on Jane Mixer's hand matching the DNA of John Rules, who was a mere 4-year-old child at the time of Jane's murder. John Rules, residing in downtown Detroit, approximately 40 miles away from the discovery site of Jane's body, remained unconnected to Gary or the victim Jane. The timing of both Jane Mixer and John Rules cases being processed in the lab concurrently raised suspicions about potential errors within the lab procedures. Grabbe contended that if an error did occur in Rules's case, it cast a doubt on the reliability of the evidence against Gary. However, Hiller stood firm with his theory that no mishaps occurred in the lab. He further backed this theory by citing testimonies from witnesses who attested to the rigorous measures implemented to maintain the integrity of all evidence and minimize the risk of errors. Lab supervisor Jeffrey Nye was called to testify as well. He asserted that he meticulously retraced every procedure and was confident that there was no contamination issue whatsoever. While Hiller's case heavily relied on DNA evidence, Grabbe focused on some other factors that diverted attention away from Gary Lederman. Grabbe raised questions about how John Rulis's blood ended up on Jane Mixer, acknowledging that the exact circumstances still remain shrouded in mystery. However, he insisted that the evidence unmistakably pointed to the evidence of 4-year-old Rules at the scene. Additionally, Grabbe also put forth some other facts that pointed towards Gary's innocence. Gary's fingerprints had failed to match any of the unidentified fingerprints from the case, and he did not own a vehicle resembling the one that was spotted fleeing the crime scene on the night of Jane's murder. And although Gary did own a .22 caliber handgun, there was no concrete evidence that proved that the same gun was used to murder Jane. Later in 2005, the trial approached its end, and Gary never opted to take the stand himself. After 2 weeks of proceedings, the jurors began deliberating, with both families anxiously awaiting the outcome. The verdict was ultimately delivered: guilty. On July 22, 2005, the jurors, after only 4 hours of deliberation, reached a unanimous decision, convicting Gary of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the chance of parole. The courtroom fell into an emotional silence as the verdict was read out loud, leaving both families grappling with a mix of shock and sorrow. Barbara, Jane's sister, recalled feeling a sense of numbness engulfing her amidst the stunned silence, while tears echoed throughout the room. Following the announcement, Gary's wife, Sally, along with her 2 children, appeared visibly in disbelief and broke down sobbing. Jane's 91-year-old father, Dan Mixer, was also present in the court. He was overwhelmed upon hearing the verdict. Tears rolled down his eyes, but this time, he was happy that his long-gone daughter had received much-awaited justice. On August 30, 2005, Judge Donald Shelton delivered the mandatory sentence, condemning Gary to spend the remainder of his days behind bars at the Ernest C. Brooks Correctional Facility in Muskegon, Michigan. It was during the sentencing that Gary broke his courtroom silence and expressed heartfelt sympathy for the Mixer family. He acknowledged that it must have been an unimaginably difficult time for the Mixer family in 1969, grappling with the loss of their beloved Jane, yet he remained firm in his denial of being involved in Jane's murder in any way. Despite the verdict, Gary adamantly refused to accept his fate and continued to fight for his innocence until later. This kept Barbara, Jane's sister, from getting the full closure she had longed for all her life. Until Gary admits to murdering Jane, there will always be a nagging doubt about what really happened to her sister all those years ago.
It was a double murder that brought 2 kinds of pain for the families left behind. For 23 years, John Van Cuylenborg has been haunted by the murders of his sister Tanya and her boyfriend Jay Cook.
Hailing from Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, 20-year-old Jay and 18-year-old Tanya were a young couple, vibrant with love and curiosity. In November 1987, they embarked on a simple getaway and had planned to return the day after. But what had begun as a journey of love and joy descended into a nightmare of unimaginable horror. Tanya and Jay never returned home and were reported missing. Almost a week after, when Tanya's body was found in the most chilling condition, the mystery behind her tragic fate started to unravel. And while Tanya had been found, there were still no signs of Jay. Who could commit such a heinous act? Could Jay have done this and then fled to somewhere else unknown? If not, where was he? And who was the monster behind Tanya's merciless murder? Tanya Van Cuylenborg, or Sweetie as her loved ones called her, was born on March 7, 1969, to the couple Jean Lorraine and Willem Van Cuylenborg. Tanya and her older brother, John, grew up in their hometown, Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, and had a childhood full of love and affection. Growing up, Tanya's loving companion was her family dog, Tessa, a golden retriever, and it was because of Tessa that Tanya had an affection towards animals and wanted to do something for their well-being. And so by 1987, after graduating high school, Tanya had been thinking about becoming a vet. By this time, Tanya had also met her boyfriend, Jay Rollin Cook, who was a senior at her school. Jay was born on December 16, 1966, to the couple Leona and Gordon, and just like Tanya, Jay too grew up in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, with his sister Laura. He was a quiet and calm kind of person who was often mistaken to be shy. By November 1987, 20-year-old Jay and 18-year-old Tanya had been together for about 6 months. For Jay's mother, Leona, the happiness on Jay's face when he was around Tanya was enough to tell her that Tanya was special to him. For Tanya's father, William, Tanya's happiness was the only thing that mattered to him. Sadly, neither of the happy families were aware of the tragedy that was about to strike. On Wednesday, November 18, 1987, Jay and Tanya had planned to run an errand for Jay's father, Gordon. However, it wasn't going to be a quick task. Gordon ran a business and needed some furnace parts which were to be picked up from Seattle, Washington State, USA. Seeing this as an opportunity to have the first trip with his girlfriend and spend more time with her, Jay asked Tanya to join him. Tanya was equally excited. She had recently picked up an interest in photography and had bought herself a camera. She grabbed her camera and tagged along with Jay. She wanted to capture all the beautiful moments of the romantic getaway. A little past noon, on the same day, November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay left in Jay's father's bronze 1977 Ford Club van. Their plan was to take a ferry from Victoria, British Columbia to Washington State, drive to the store in Seattle and pick up the parts Jay's father had asked him to collect. Since it would be a time-consuming journey, Jay and Tanya had planned to spend the night in Seattle before heading home the next day. On Thursday, November 19, 1987, Tanya and Jay's families waited for their return. They were expected to arrive around noon that day. But when it was way past that time and there were no signs of the young couple, fear started to creep in. Even though Tanya and Jay were young, they were quite responsible. It was unlike them not to call and inform if they had a change of plans or if they were going to be late. Tanya's mother, Jean, sensed that something was definitely wrong. And while Tanya's father felt the same, he tried to calm her down and reassure her that everything would be okay. But sadly, as the sun inched closer to the horizon on the evening of November 19, 1987, and with the couple not returning home, both the families reached out to the Victoria Police Department to report them missing. John, Tanya's brother, was at college when he got the news that his sister had gone missing. He rushed back to his home to help his family look for Tanya and Jay. Detectives from the British Columbia Police Department took up the case of the missing couple, and with the help of the Washington State Police Department, they were able to track down Tanya and Jay's movements from the day they left for their trip across the border. According to the detectives, Tanya and Jay took the 4 p.m. car ferry from Victoria. It was a 90-minute journey, and the young couple exited the ferry by 5:30 p.m. at Port Angeles, Washington State. Detectives were even able to gather witnesses who said that they had seen Tanya and Jay heading south on Highway 101. They were spotted in the Washington town of Hoodsport around 8 p.m. and then once again in the town of Allen about an hour later. Detectives believed that Tanya and Jay were headed to Bremerton to get another ferry, which left at 10:20 p.m. and took them to Seattle. And after arriving in Seattle, they planned to park the van near the Kingdom and spend the night there. Sadly, from this point onward, there were no further traces of Tanya and Jay. Days went by, but there were no signs of Tanya and Jay. But then on Wednesday, November 24, 1987, everyone's worst fears came true. About 80 miles from Seattle, a partially clothed body of a woman was discovered in a ditch next to the isolated Parsons Creek Road, near the towns of Algiers and Burlington, Skagit County in Washington State.
When we got out, we stopped alongside the road. There was a uniformed deputy already down just below the body, where the body was. I went down to examine the body and see what was there. I saw a half-clothed female.
Although the detectives were sure that it was Tanya, they called in her brother John, who confirmed and identified the body as Tanya's.
Very difficult time. You're hoping that it's not Tanya, but, this may well be the answer. But we're very quiet. There wasn't a lot to be said between the four of us. We got to Cedar Woolley, and my dad and I together identified Tanya's body.
The condition of Tanya's body told a gruesome story. It was evident that she had to go through extreme horrors in her final moments. She wasn't wearing any pants or any underwear, and her bra had been pushed up to her shoulders to reveal her breasts. Tanya had been and then shot in the back of her head at close range with a .38 caliber gun. There were traces of a foreign bodily fluid found on Tanya's body. Additionally, detectives found some plastic zip ties lying alongside the road close to the body. Detectives believed that the zip ties had been used to secure her in the van and bring her to the location of the crime. Detectives told both the families that there was a chance that Jay carried out the heinous and murder to later flee from the area. They told them to be prepared for this bitter possibility, as Jay was now a suspect in Tanya's murder. However, neither Jay's family nor Tanya's family believed that Jay would do such a thing. Just the next day, on November 25, 1987, detectives found Jay's van near a bus station in the city of Bellingham, 14 miles away from the location where Tanya's body was found.
The van was seized and then it was examined by forensic people.
Well, once it's brought in, it's photographed completely all the way around, every square inch of it. The license plates are photographed for identification purposes on that vehicle. Once that's all done, the doors were opened and we examined anything we could find inside the van.
Upon searching the van, they found a Bremerton-Seattle ferry ticket, some more zip ties, a pair of black pants which belonged to Tanya, and a comforter with bloodstains all over it. There were more traces of a foreign bodily fluid found on Tanya's pants and also on the zip ties discovered in the van. Additionally, detectives also found a palm print on the back door of the van. At that point, the detectives were not certain whether Jay had actually committed the crime or if there was someone else involved. However, given the evidence at hand, the detectives became more fearful that Jay had also been a victim of foul play. Later that same day, on November 25, 1987, investigators found more zip ties under the porch of a tavern, which was only 2 blocks away from the van. In addition to that, they found keys to Jay's van, Tanya's driver's license, and wallet, and a half-empty box of ammunition. And not so surprisingly, the ammunition inside the box was a match to the bullet that killed Tanya. Amid the pile of this new evidence, detectives also found a pair of plastic surgical gloves. Detectives believed that the killer had intentionally left them behind as a calling card for the police. The killer wanted the detectives to know that since he was wearing gloves, he did not leave any fingerprints behind, and the detectives needn't look for it. The killer's confidence of having nothing left behind at the crime scene that would connect him to the case seemed like a taunt to the detectives. Jay's family's hopes of finding him alive were hanging by a thread, but that too came down crashing on Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1987. Jay's body was discovered underneath High Bridge off Crescent Lake Road near Monroe, Washington. It was about 70 miles away from where Tanya's body was found. Jay's body had been covered with a blue blanket, only to conceal the cruelty that he had gone through prior to his death. Jay had been beaten with rocks, as well as strangled to death with twine and 2 red dog collars.
The medical examiner came to the conclusion that Jay died from asphyxiation, both from the ligature that was around his neck, but also the fact that the tissue in the cigarette pack had pushed his tongue to the back of his throat. Jay had suffered, unfortunately. The wounds that he had and the way that he had been killed is not something that happens fast. He was still trying to breathe. He was still trying to fight back as he was being suffocated or asphyxiated.
His hands had been bound with zip ties. Some tissues and a pack of cigarettes had been stuffed in his mouth. Looking at the evidence discovered with Jay's body and the gruesome condition his body was in, detectives believed that the way Jay had been murdered was similar to the abuse they had seen before behind prison walls. The efforts the killer had made to conceal Jay's identity were indicative of someone familiar with police procedures. This led the detectives to believe that whoever killed Jay might have spent time in the prison system before. And surprisingly, Jay's body had been found near the Monroe Honor Farm, a men's prison which was the second largest in the state.
Certain things would have made it a serial killer type of a situation. Jay's body was found close to the Honor Farm, which was run by the inmates that were in the prison in Monroe.
Detectives wondered whether it was a clue or a mere coincidence. Determined not to leave any stones unturned, they decided to investigate the prison theory. However, it was another dead end in the search for the killer. As the investigation pressed forward with full force, it was time for Jay and Tanya's loved ones to say their final goodbyes. A funeral service was organized for Tanya, and she was laid to rest in the Ross Bay Cemetery, Victoria, in British Columbia. Soon after that, a cremation for Jay took place and his remains were scattered at Fulford Harbor in Salt Spring Island. Even though the identity of Tanya and Jay's killer remained a mystery, the detectives had enough evidence to figure out what must have happened on the night of November 18, 1987, when Tanya and Jay arrived in Washington State. Detectives believed that there was a good chance that Tanya and Jay most likely caught the attention of their killer on the 10:20 p.m. ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. Seeing that Tanya and Jay were a friendly, young couple traveling alone, the killer must have thought of them as easy targets. The killer probably made his first contact with the couple at the ferry's lounge and got acquainted with them, probably after giving them a false introduction. Unaware of his real intentions, Tanya and Jay might have indulged in a friendly conversation with the killer. Detectives believe that the killer might have asked Tanya and Jay for a ride across the Puget Sound. By the time they exited the ferry in downtown Seattle, they were already in the company of the killer. Taking advantage of Tanya and Jay's innocence, the killer fooled them into giving him a ride, and once he led them to an isolated spot, he put his plan into action. The killer had his eyes set on Tanya since he first saw her in the ferry. He wanted to assault her, but Jay was in the way. Detectives believe that he killed Jay first, then took Tanya to another spot where he assaulted and killed her. Then he dumped the van and got rid of the evidence. Since items such as zip ties, a gun, gloves, and other tools had been used in the crime, detectives were sure that whoever killed Tanya and Jay came prepared with a kill kit. He was out to do harm and was only looking for prey. Detectives also believe that the killer was familiar with the area in Washington where the bodies and van were found. Additionally, looking at the way he killed Tanya and Jay, detectives believe that the killer had most likely committed similar crimes in the past. He seemed quite experienced and knew what he was doing. Fearing this, the detectives grew worried that he would continue to commit such crimes until he was caught. He had been successfully evading justice, and as long as he remained free, he could be a danger to society. There's an old saying among detectives that a killer makes at least one mistake, and although the killer seemed confident that he left behind nothing that would get him caught, he was wrong. The day Jay and Tanya left for the romantic trip, Jay had been wearing a waist-length black ski jacket with red piping on the sleeves. That jacket was never recovered at any of the crime scenes. Additionally, Tanya's olive drab day pack and her Minolta 35mm camera with the serial number 2067048 were also never found. Hence, the detectives believed that the killer might have taken all these items, which could help them track him. Detectives circulated information about the missing items in Washington State and hoped that someone would see him with these incriminating items and inform the authorities. Sadly, no such sightings were ever reported. Detectives also looked into the possibility that the murders were connected to those of several other couples in the area, but that too led them to a dead end. While the detectives were busy investigating the double homicide, every single day was a painful one for the families of Jay and Tanya, dealing with the grief of losing their loved ones who had their whole lives ahead of them. Just as both families were trying to put the tragic incidents to the past and move on, someone did something unthinkable, adding insult to injury. Just 2 weeks after Tanya and Jay's murders took place, their family started to receive some threatening letters and morbid greeting cards during the first week of December 1987. The frequency of these incoming letters increased around the Christmas holidays. The letters gave a taunting description of the murders, and the author took full responsibility for them. Rubbing salt into their wounds, the author also wrote to the families that he harbored deep hatred for Canadians and said that the opportunity to kill Tanya and Jay was too good to pass up. Additionally, he threatened the detectives that he would kill again and bragged that he would never get caught. Over the next year, Tanya and Jay's families received many letters, 19 of which had been mailed over 3 different holidays, and as usual, all the letters used anti-Canadian phrases and more hurtful language. The first 2 letters arrived on December 3, 1987, and were postmarked in Seattle. About a dozen more came in every single month for a year. The writer sent Hallmark greeting cards with pictures of teddy bears and kittens for Father's Day, Mother's Day, and Christmas. He also sent letters to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a British Columbia newspaper. And in all the letters, the author claimed responsibility for the murders. All of the cards and letters were written by the same person and were sometimes signed Tanya or Jay. Even though the detectives pointed out that the letters were postmarked from New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle, the author's identity and address remained a complete puzzle. Nonetheless, detectives remained hopeful to find out who was behind these tormenting greeting cards. However, detectives did find some odd details in those letters which were noteworthy. The handwriting on the cards was very distinctive. The author also made use of some very specific phrases over and over again. Phrases such as "Hallelujah, Bloody Jesus" and "Greetings and Salutations" seemed to be the author's favorite. As of then, police did not find anything in the cards that would definitively prove that the author of those letters was the killer. In regard to that, the letters didn't mention any details that had already been released to the public. Detectives believe that in case the author wasn't the killer, he might have still have been involved in the crime and may have something to do with Tanya and Jay. And even though the detectives were on his tail, he continued to make life miserable for Jay's and Tanya's families. Examining the letters did help the detectives narrow down their list of suspects. There was also a possibility that the writer was Canadian. This suspicion emerged from the fact that the letters used some specific grammar and punctuation, which indicated that the author was educated in Canada. Despite these observations, there was a significant lack of evidence in this case. They only hoped that the killer might have opened up about his crime to someone, and that someday, those people would come forward and help the detectives identify him. 3 years after Tanya and Jay's murder, there was a small development in the case, which made the detectives feel that they were inching closer to nabbing the killer. In 1990, detectives were able to locate the camera lens that belonged to Tanya's missing camera at a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon. However, the lens had been transferred to this pawn shop from another one, and sadly, that shop did not have records from the time it was originally brought in. As a result, detectives were unable to figure out who originally brought the lens. Looking at the extremely slow progress in the case and hoping to gather more information, Tanya's family offered a $50,000 reward for anyone who could give any information that would lead to the arrest of the killer. Detectives did receive a few tips, but sadly, none of them led anywhere. Samples of DNA from Tanya's body and pants, zip ties, and the threatening letters were preserved for future reference. And with no new developments or potential suspects in the investigation, the case of Tanya and Jay's gruesome murder joined the pile of many other cold cases. In 1995, Detective Jim Scharf from Snohomish County put together a cold case team consisting of some top-tier detectives, and the case of Tanya and Jay's murders caught their attention. Reviewing the gruesome and merciless nature of the crime, Tanya and Jay's case became one of the team's first cases. This new team of detectives started going through the case files and re-examined all the evidence that had been collected during the time of the original investigation. Over the next few years, detectives arrived on multiple theories, followed many leads, and even questioned several potential suspects. But none of these efforts worked out in their favor.
Detective Scharf was chasing those leads down day by day, the pit bull that he is. It took a lot of Detective Scharf's time to track down those leads, only to find that that wasn't the person.
According to Detective Scharf, more than 200 names came across his desk, and some of them were convicted felons, but none of them could be linked to Tanya and Jay's murder. There were no further developments in the case until 2003. With DNA technology making progress every day, detectives thought of giving it a shot. A DNA sample from the bodily fluids found on Tanya, her pants, and the zip ties was examined, and the suspect's DNA profile was developed. The Washington State Patrol named it Individual A's Profile and uploaded it to CODES, the FBI's national database for DNA profiles of offenders. However, the DNA profile did not match anyone. Serial killers such as Robert Yates and Charles Sinclair, who were active in the Seattle area in 1987, were questioned as well. But the DNA evidence from the crime scene cleared them of any involvement. And yet again, there was a halt in the investigation. About 7 years later, in August 2010, scientists at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in Marysville informed the detectives that they were able to collect DNA samples, which were found on the threatening letters Tanya and Jay's families received almost 23 years ago. Later, when these samples were tested, the scientists made a shocking discovery. The DNA samples found on the letters were not a match to the samples found on Tanya's body, clothes, and zip ties at the crime scene. This led the detectives to consider the possibility of multiple culprits being involved in the double homicide. Equipped with this new finding in the case, detectives asked famous TV station Q13 Fox for help. The station then featured Tanya and Jay's case with fresh updates twice on their hit local TV show, Washington's Most Wanted, that had already helped capture 144 fugitives. And soon, the detectives started to receive tips from the viewers of the show. Victoria cold case detectives were finally able to identify the author of those threatening letters and track the writer to Seattle.
Adding to the horror, someone taunting the families with abusive letters about the deaths. This summer, a push to identify the killer and the author has yielded at least one answer. Washington State Police say they know who wrote the letters, and he's Canadian.
The man was arrested at Seattle's public library when the detectives carried out a sting operation. At the time he was identified, the man was in his 70s and was a Canadian citizen. Upon taking a closer look into his life, detectives found out that the man also had severe mental health issues. He grew up in several Canadian foster care homes and faced abuse throughout his childhood. And probably as a result of that, he faced problems in his professional life and blamed fellow Canadians for his troubles.
I told him right up front, listen, we know that you wrote these letters. And he said, yeah, I did do it.
When the detectives confronted him about his insensitive actions towards the families of Tanya and Jay, he didn't try to hide anything. In fact, he readily admitted that he was the one who wrote those filthy letters.
In fact, I knew that you guys would probably be looking for me because I saw a little clip on TV where I recognized my letters myself.
Police say the letter writer is a homeless man who wrote the notes during a particularly low point in his life. He told investigators he was sorry about what he'd done and even said that he once tried to contact the families here in Victoria to tell them that.
Detectives sat down with him and interviewed him for several hours and finally came to the conclusion that he had nothing to do with the murders of Tanya and Jay. Neither did he have any connection to the person who actually committed the crime, nor did he know anything about the murders other than what had already been shared over the news. Because the statute of limitations for harassment was 3 years, the man couldn't be charged with a crime in regard to the letters he sent the victims' families and was let go. 8 more years went by, and Tanya and Jay's killer remained on the loose. But things changed when Joseph James D'Angelo, responsible for multiple assaults and murders, was identified after evading law enforcement for almost 43 years. Also known as the Golden State Killer, Joseph was identified using genetic genealogy and was arrested on April 25, 2018 in California. Inspired by the breakthrough arrest in the Golden State Killer case, Detective Scharf realized that the use of genetic genealogy held great potential in solving cold cases like Tanya and Jay's, even though the technology was quite new at the time. It seemed like the reliable option he was left with. Detective Scharf presented Tanya and Jay's case to the scientists at Parabon Nanolabs, and after a detailed discussion, the lab decided to upload individual A's DNA profile to GED Match on April 27, 2018. Shortly after that, Snohomish County detectives released a paraben DNA snapshot composite of the killer that had been created based on the DNA evidence. These composites were based on predictions of what the suspect would possibly have looked like at ages 25, 45, and 65. As a result of the paraben analysis, it was believed that the suspect was a Caucasian male of European descent, with hazel or green eyes, fair skin, possible freckles, and likely male pattern baldness. Once individual A's DNA had been uploaded, genetic genealogist C.C. Moore was called into work on the case. She had been following Tanya and Jay's case for years and looking at how 2 young, innocent lives were cut short. She felt a personal connection to it.
I had had a lot of doubts whether this was the right thing for me to do, and I finally made the decision, okay, I'm gonna do this.
She had been following Tanya and Jay's case for years and looking at how 2 young, innocent lives were cut short. Cece's parents were from the Pacific Northwest, and she was the same age as Tanya would have been.
She was killed right when I was graduating high school and going on to college, and my life was just really beginning, and hers ended so tragically. And so I think it always stuck with me.
Genealogist C.C. Moore logged on to GED Match to examine individual A's DNA and look for any potential matches. And soon enough, she was able to find 2 profiles who shared enough DNA with individual A to be his second cousins. In this case, the cousins shared DNA with individual A, but not with each other. This meant that they were related to the suspect, Individual A, on different branches of his family tree. But to figure out who Individual A was, Cece needed to build a family tree using the two profiles who were most likely the suspect's second cousins.
Now, fortunately, one of the people at the top of that list had a really unique name.
And what was her name?
Chelsea Rustad.
I really like to solve puzzles, and genealogy kind of is like that. It offers you this endless stream of blanks to fill in. My name's Chelsea Rustad, and in 2013, I began my search for my own family history.
The second profile belonged to a woman who went by the name Chelsea Rustad. In 2015, Chelsea Rustad, a woman from Tumwater, Washington, had uploaded her DNA to a public database in the hopes of exploring other branches of her family tree and finding more relatives. And although Chelsea was not related to either Jay or Tanya, she had never thought that one day this process would prompt a visit from cold case detectives and her DNA would help solve the mystery of who killed Tanya and Jay. Cece was equipped with all the information she needed. She built the family trees of those two top matches, and soon she was able to discover how and where they converged. And just within 2 hours, Cece was able to examine the resulting family tree and find the name of the person she believed was the killer of Jay and Tanya. Cece identified Individual A as William Earl Talbot II. Finally, there was a name and face to this suspect whose identity had remained a mystery for 31 years. Upon hearing the name, Detective Jim Scharf ran it through the system to check if there were any records. He was surprised to learn that Talbot had no felony convictions in the past. This was a person who had eluded capture for more than 3 decades, and using the power of genetic genealogy, Cece was able to identify this person in just 2 hours. Cece didn't want to waste even a second after identifying Talbot, determined to learn about him and his whereabouts. She had already started looking for Talbot online, but she could barely find anything about him. There were no records of any marriages or kids. Years ago in 2013, Chelsea Rustad, she was able to hunt down his sisters and father on social media, who had no clue about the investigation into Tanya and Jay's case. About 2 years ago, before she submitted her DNA to any websites, Chelsea Googled her grandfather's sister, Blanche, and found out a lot of information about her and her family online. Blanche's daughter was Patty Talbot, who had 3 daughters and 1 son, and the son was no one else but William Earl Talbot. The Talbots turned out to be Chelsea's second cousins. Chelsea connected with the 2 of the sisters over Facebook, but their brother William Earl Talbot was a mystery.
This guy was just kind of a question mark, off the grid.
Even after she uploaded her DNA to Ancestry.com and GED Match in 2015, she figured William Talbot was probably estranged from his family and didn't give it much thought. So when those investigators showed up on her doorstep in 2018, she was in complete shock. Now that Detective Scharf knew about Talbot's family members, he embarked on a journey to speak with all of them, and while interviewing Talbot's friends and family, Detective Scharf uncovered more details about Talbot and his past. In audio-taped interviews with Talbot's sisters, Detective Scharf learned that Talbot had a history of anger and violence. He was a troubled child and carried all the wrong traits into his teens and young adulthood. During the mid-1970s, when Talbot was only an 11-year-old child, his father was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident, and Talbot would still lash out amid that family crisis. He would get into heated arguments with his sisters a lot and would end up hurting them physically and emotionally. As he grew older and stronger, the beatings turned more severe, and the sisters almost felt defensiveless going against him. One of Talbot's sisters even said that he beat her up so badly one time that her tailbone broke and she had to be admitted to the hospital.
He was a really angry kid. He beat me up, broke my tailbone, I had to go to the hospital.
Yeah, he'd be a bonehead, but not to the point of attacking or killing somebody, no.
Even while each of his sisters confirmed that Talbot was a violent person, they also felt he would not go to the extent to assault and murder someone. Detectives had enough evidence to know that they were following the correct lead, and given Talbot's violent past, his actions were sitting well with the details of Jay and Tanya's case. All that the detectives needed now was to make an arrest. However, that wasn't going to be very easy. To make an arrest, Detective Scharf needed to confirm that the DNA found on Tanya's body and pants at the crime scene belonged to Talbot. Investigators found out that Talbot used to drive a truck and was a resident of Seattle. Detectives decided to tail him for a few days, looking for opportunities to collect his DNA. And on May 8, 2018, he dropped a cup from the window of his truck and drove away. Detectives quickly collected the cup as evidence and rushed to the Washington State Patrol Lab that same day. While the detectives awaited the results, scientists at the lab tested the DNA sample from the cup against the sample of individual A. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins confirmed that the DNA on Talbot's cup was a perfect match to that of individual A and broke the news to Detective Scharf. After reaching dozens of dead ends and following hundreds of leads for more than 30 years, on May 17, 2018, then 55-year-old William Earl Talbot II was finally arrested and taken into custody in Seattle. The first call Detective Scharf made after the arrest was to Tanya's older brother, John Van Cuylenborg.
Told me that, he goes, yeah, we got him, we've arrested him. And I said, really? My first question was, well, where is he? All those years of all the phone calls and all the information, all of a sudden, finally someone had been arrested. You know, this is the first arrest in 31 years.
John was also present at the press conference on May 18, 2018, when Jim Scharf and the other detectives made the announcement of Talbot's arrest. John said the information about his little sister's killer being finally caught after 31 years sent a chill down his spine. He described it as an overwhelming feeling. Jay's sister, Laura, and mother, Leona, attended the conference as well. Laura said that it was a feeling of mixed emotions. On a similar note, Leona described it as a bittersweet feeling. On one hand, she was happy to gain some form of closure, but on the other, she still didn't have her only son, and nothing could bring him back. Although Talbot's DNA was a match to the foreign bodily fluids found on Tanya, her pants, and on the zip ties, detectives conducted another test and confirmed that the palm print found on the back door of the van Jay and Tanya were traveling in was also a match to Talbot. Talbot was initially charged only with first-degree murder of Tanya Van Cuylenborg. However, nearly a month after his arrest, on May 17, 2018, he was also charged with first-degree murder of J. Roland Cook. On June 16, 2018, Talbot claimed that he was innocent and pleaded not guilty at a preliminary hearing. Detectives found out that when the murders were committed, Talbot was 24 years old and lived in Woodinville from 1984 to 1993. His house was only 7 miles from where Jay's body was found. In 1987, Talbot was working as a delivery driver and made regular stops in the area where Jay and Tanya were headed to pick up the furnace parts. Additionally, detectives also learned that Talbot was fired after a few months before he committed the murders. Talbot's former roommate, too, came forward to inform the detectives that he had seen a blue blanket in his home and in Talbot's car. It was similar to the one found on Jay's body at the crime scene. The roommate also confirmed that Talbot had a difficult relationship with his relatives, particularly with his sisters. He added that Talbot was involved in drugs and had personality changes whenever he was under the influence of alcohol. He also recalled seeing a bronze van, resembling the one Jay and Tanya were traveling in, outside of his home on a misty day in the fall of 1987. Finally, he recalled that Talbot would often take him to the same area where Jay's body was later found. Facing 2 charges of first-degree murder in the case of Tanya and Jay, Talbot was held on $2.5 million of bail. On Tuesday, June 11, 2019, Talbot went on trial for Jay and Tanya's murders. He pleaded not guilty to both the charges. Before the trial could even begin, there was a slight complication. One of the jurors, Juror 40 in particular, told both the state and the defense that as a child, she had witnessed her mother go through a lot of domestic abuse. She couldn't say for sure whether her personal experiences in life would affect her decisions in the trial until the time came. But before the defense and state agreed to move ahead with the trial, Juror 40 promised to give her very best in the trial. In the court, Talbot was being represented by attorney Rachel Forty with John Scott, acting as her co-counsel. Rachel and John argued that there was an actual innocent explanation for Talbot's DNA ending up on Tanya's body and pants.
Every indication of the DNA found from my client indicated consensual.
They admit that Talbot had with Tanya, but they deny he raped or killed her or Jay Cook.
Talbot's defense claimed that Talbot did have a sensual encounter with Tanya, but it was fully consensual. Additionally, the defense claimed that both Tanya and Jay were killed by someone else. The prosecution countered these claims and highlighted that it would not make sense for Tanya to indulge in any kind of activity with Talbot, since she was with Jay, her boyfriend, in a foreign country and also on her menstrual period at the time. Rachel's co-counsel, John Scott, said there was not enough evidence to prove Talbot guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He pointed out that Tanya and Jay had been missing for several days before their bodies were discovered, which implied that the couple must have come across their actual killer much later on. In addition to that, Talbot's lawyer said the detectives were unable to link Talbot to the type of gun that had been used to kill Tanya. Neither were they able to link Talbot to the pack of cigarettes that had been stuffed in Jay's mouth, and nor to the red-colored dog collars used to strangle Jay. Deputy Prosecutor Matt Baldock said that if Talbot's DNA being found on Tanya's body and her clothes was not enough to prove Talbot's guilt, then Talbot's DNA being found on the zip ties and the palm print found on the back of Jay's van, being a perfect match to Talbot, confirmed his involvement in the murders beyond a reasonable doubt. Furthermore, Prosecutor Baldock highlighted the fact that Talbot used to live merely 7 miles from where Jay's body was discovered. Prosecutor Baldock said that this proved the connection between Jay's murder, Tanya's murder, and the van. Towards the end of the trial, defense attorney Rachel Forty argued that Detective Jim Scharf from the cold case team had tunnel vision. Rachel pointed out that Detective Scharf and his team jumped to conclusions, never stopped to consider that perhaps the person who left the DNA was not the murderer.
They never stopped to consider that perhaps the person who left the DNA was not the murderer.
Talbot chose not to take the stand in his defense, and his lawyer seemed pretty confident that the jury would agree and there was not enough evidence to prove Talbot guilty. In their closing arguments, the defense told the jury that the police were unreasonably focused on the DNA. In the prosecution's closing statement, Baldock said that the only reasonable theory in the case was that Talbot had overpowered the young couple. He had come prepared and had planned to assault Tanya and then kill her and Jay. Baldock pointed out that Talbot had zip ties, gloves, and a gun. It was all premeditated, and he clearly knew what he was doing. Juror 40, along with 11 other jurors, had been hearing witness testimonies for 2 weeks, and they began deliberating on June 25, 2019. After 3 days of deliberation, on June 28, 2019, they reached a verdict and announced Talbot guilty and convicted him for the murders of 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg and 20-year-old Jay Rollin Cook. The verdict came as a shock to the defense, as they confidently expected the opposite results. Almost a month after his conviction, on July 24, 2019, William Earl Talbot II was handed 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
The only possible sentence on each count is to impose a sentence of life without possibility of release.
Jay and Tanya's families were present in the courtroom, and so was Chelsea Restad, the only relative of Talbot who was there to support the victims. Chelsea had never spoken to either Jay or Tanya's family and was nervous about facing them in court. But with their blessing, she decided to attend Talbot's sentencing, where she met Tanya's older brother John for the first time. More than 2 years later, when Talbot was locked up behind bars and everything seemed perfect, a controversy rolled in. Talbot made the appeal on the grounds that his right to an impartial jury was violated because of a biased juror. Juror 40 had deliberated his case. The double murder conviction of William Earl Talbot II, who had been found guilty in the homicide of Tanya and Jay, was overturned due to juror bias. The decision was handed out on Monday, December 8, 2021, when the court stated that they were not sure whether the juror was completely free of bias or not when she made her decision in the case. This was the first time that the defense attorneys had ever challenged the forensic genealogy. The Division I Court of Appeals in Washington State admitted that there was room for error. They went on to say that they could not conclude that Juror 40 was sufficiently free of bias and that Talbot was provided a fair and impartial jury. This ended up being the reason behind the court's reversal of Talbot's conviction. Furthermore, Talbot and his attorneys raised many other issues related to the evidence in the case, citing the additional court papers which Talbot prepared himself. This decision obviously did not sit well with the prosecutors and the families of Jay and Tanya. Later, they appealed the ruling of Talbot's conviction, being overturned to the state's highest court. In September 2022, Chief Justice Stephen Gonzalez noted during oral arguments that Juror 40 had not made any statements that showed unquestionable bias or a blatant conflict of interest. The court emphasized that if a party allowed a juror to be seated, and if they did not exhaust their peremptory challenges, they could not appeal on the basis that a juror should have been excused for cause. 3 months later, in December 2022, the state Supreme Court reinstated Talbot's murder convictions. The court stated that Talbot's defense attorneys should have dismissed the juror prior to the trial if they felt she was biased, and since Talbot's defense attorneys did not use their option to excuse her when the trial took place in June 2019, they couldn't file any further appeals on the same grounds. Ever since Talbot was arrested in 2018, he has remained in custody at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington, based on the arguments about insufficient evidence, the inadequacy of the police investigation, and a series of other alleged missteps at trial that were not weighed in the State Court of Appeals' first ruling. Talbot's attorney planned to file another appeal. Ever since his conviction in 2019, Talbot has maintained his innocence. Chelsea Ristad, Talbot's second cousin, said that her sympathy was for Jay and Tanya and their families, despite her genetic ties to Talbot. She was proud that her DNA helped bring a ruthless killer to justice, describing her role in the case and her connection to Talbot. Chelsea went on to write a book about her experience and called it Inherited Secrets. Although nothing could bring Tanya and Jay back, Talbot's conviction did bring their families some form of closure. Jay's mother, Leona, said that she still had one of Jay's old sweaters in her drawer.
Some of us wanted a shirt or a sweater. You could wear them. You could put them to your nose and smell him. I still have that old sweater in my dresser drawer.
Tanya's father, William, passed away on May 14, 1997, at the age of 62. He never got a chance to see his daughter get justice. Tanya's mother, Jean, passed away on March 3, 2020, at the age of 87. She left in peace, knowing that her daughter's killer would never be a free man. Both Jean and William were laid to rest at the Ross Bay Cemetery, where Tanya rested in peace. Her gravestone still had the last line of a poem Tanya had written when she was 17 inscribed on it. It read, "There is a place that I know of, where up above there flies a dove, and slowly, as it turns to dawn, she parts her wings, and then she's gone." How do you think Talbot overpowered both Jay and Tanya? Do you think he acted alone, or did he have some help? Is it possible that Talbot had more victims who cannot be linked to him?